Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
They say that if you look into this pond, the dead who lie beneath its surface will stare into your soul and see the secrets you've kept hidden. They also used to say that if you touch yourself, you'll grow hair on your palms. Well, do you see any hair? Marcus shoved his open palm into Claire's face, smearing his hairless, though sweaty, hand across it. She pushed him away, then kneed him in the groin. He went down, soaking his pants in the pond. Everyone laughed except Marcus, of course. Derek helped him up, while I stood by and stared into the pond that had, according to the crooked post nearby, once been a fairly large lake. Its surface rippled from the occasional landing of a bug upon a floating leaf, or the near-surface activity of a fish. Otherwise, it was placid, undisturbed, and clean, despite its proximity to the road just behind us. We had only stopped there to take a break from our road trip. Once everyone had stretched their legs and relieved themselves, the latter of which Marcus seemed to have had difficulty after Claire's retaliation, we loaded ourselves and our things back into Derek's car. We drove for a few more hours, with Claire and Marcus bickering the entire time, while Derek talked to me without pause, as if oblivious to the arguments behind us. We were all friends, but Claire and Marcus could only handle so much of each other before things soured. We slowly passed through the Midwest, stopping at diners, bars, and grills, and steakhouses along the way. When considering our budget for the trip, gas had been the second most important consideration. The first had been the food fund, and its use had been limited to the items that were grease-covered, flame-grilled, or served by portly women who called you sugar, honey, darling, or sweetheart. It was the one thing Claire and Marcus had agreed upon. Everyone was required to gain a few pounds on the trip. A few hours after departing from the pond that had been a lake, we stopped again, this time at a motel where we could rest for the night. I was especially tired, having driven the entirety of the trip up to that point. It would be Claire's turn in the morning, for which I was thankful, because it meant she wouldn't be immediately next to Marcus. Derek, self-designated driver, would remain in the front seat. As I pulled into the parking lot, I tried to think of something I could offer Marcus in exchange for allowing me to rest my legs across his lap during the next day's drive. The clerk at the front desk of the motel seemed young, younger than us even, but he spoke with an air of authority befitting someone much older. His demeanor was also grave, as if he suspected that we were up to no good entirely based upon our age. We'd been polite with him and hadn't come in howling or messing around, as you'd expect a group of early 20-somethings to do at 2 a.m. While we were set on expanding our bellies, we had sworn off alcohol, since everyone had to take a turn driving at some point. The young man retrieved our room keys almost begrudgingly from their hooks and passed them to us as if offering his very last dollar. Despite his unwelcoming manner, we wished him a pleasant night and headed to our assigned rooms. Claire and I were in one, with 2 beds, while Marcus and Derek were in another, with 1 bed. The arrangement was agreed upon and established by Claire and I. Before they could speak up, the clerk had said he couldn't spare 2 two-bedroom rooms, and we hadn't bothered protesting otherwise. After all, it was a roadside motel, not a luxury hotel where a little monetary pressure could magically induce room availability. We unpacked only what we needed. Claire and I hauled out a PS4 and Derek's monitor and spent the night relaxing in our separate rooms. We had a call on speaker, going for both rooms, to casually communicate whenever it was needed, since shouting through the thin walls would have probably brought down the ire of the clerk upon us. Claire and I played Resident Evil 5, one of the few games on the console that had split-screen co-op. Derek watched Event Horizon on his laptop, a movie he'd seen probably 12 times before, while Marcus played Dead Space on his. Horror, as one might be able to tell, was a shared interest of ours, and the original basis of our friendship. We had all met in a horror literature course in college, and bonded almost immediately. Who could have guessed that real, tangible horror would come to us that night? A horror without name, more potent in its awfulness than any real or fictional thing we'd ever experienced. As Claire and I cleared monstrous, skinless, crawling things from yet another corridor of an underground biomedical research facility, we spoke with Derek and Marcus about the specifics of tomorrow. In exchange for my aforementioned mode of passenger relaxation, I offered Marcus some of my prized oatmeal cookies, which my mom had prepared for me, and only me, she had insisted, prior to the trip. They're home-baked, glazed with buttercream icing, and could probably classify as an illicit substance. They are that damn good. He agreed, as I knew he would. He had tried them before, and it would have taken a stronger man than Marcus to deny the offer. Derek asked Claire if she had memorized the route, and Claire confirmed that she had, although she questioned why she would need to, since he had appointed himself as navigator. We all knew that Derek had done it solely because he hated sitting in the back, where the air conditioning was broken. Regardless of positioning, the frontal vents never sent their cooling flow back there, either. He quickly shushed us, as if the present moment in the movie was some part he'd never seen before. Claire rolled her eyes, and we returned our focus to the game. A few seconds later, when we had reached the area's end, the power of our room went out. Claire and I cursed simultaneously, as did Eric and Marcus a moment later. Marcus, Claire, and I had reason to, having lost our progress in our respective games. Marcus was watching the movie on his laptop and hadn't been interrupted by the outage. Since both rooms had lost power almost at the same time, we immediately, rationally assumed that it was a motel-wide situation. We didn't suspect that only our rooms had had their power shut off. We also agreed not to call the front desk and ask about what had happened. There had been several cars in the motel lot, so we figured the clerk would be getting plenty of calls already. No point in us waiting for the line to clear only to be told that he, or whoever handled such issues, was working on it. A knock came to our door about 2 minutes later. In the interim, between the outage and the knock, Claire and I had started to get our stuff ready for the trip tomorrow. We agreed that even if the power came back sooner than later, we didn't feel like going through the same area in our game all over again that night. Our bags were on our bed, and we were loading the equipment back into them. Within my bag was a can of pepper spray, another gift from my mother for the trip. I glanced at the can as I loaded my controllers into a pouch, but thought nothing of it, and zipped up the bag with the can buried beneath cables and plastic. When the knock came, I was sure that it was the clerk stopping by to inform us of what had happened. Claire must have thought similarly, because she hopped off the bed, flicking her phone's light off as she did so. She went to the door, unlocked it, and threw it open. Before she could make a sound, she was snatched up into the air by some long appendage that had descended from the roof of the building. My mind hadn't quite processed exactly what had happened due to the darkness of the room and suddenness of her aerial abduction. So when the appendage came back down, presumably to pull me into the night as well, I remained on the bed, staring at the overgrown limb, outlined in white by the moon's pale glow. It wasn't until the fingers, all three of them, angled inward, past the threshold of the door that I thought to get up and close it. I fell off the bed in my haste, but managed to get up and close the door before the limb could come probing the room. I pressed myself against the door, thinking that the massive arm would try to force its way in, given its size and the accompanying strength, I guess, that it would have possessed. But it didn't bang on the door, nor try to rip it from the hinges. To my surprise, it knocked politely on the wood, even though it could have easily smashed the thing to pieces. Those knocks, that common 7-note rhythm I'm sure we all know, brought me nothing but dread. Its use of that friendly greeting somehow made it seem even more sinister than before. I wanted to call out Claire's name, but part of me, with some morbid sureness, speculated that Claire was already dead. That as the thing above knocked on the door, with one elongated arm, it tossed her bones aside with another. The other part of me was just too damn scared to make any noise at all, even though the thing above presumably knew that there was someone else in the room. Why else would it have knocked? In my completely justifiable absent-mindedness due to the horror of the moment, I had forgotten about the still ongoing call with Derek and Marcus. Claire's phone had been in her hand, and the call had been placed with it. As I did my best to silence any noises produced by my internal organs, I heard Derek's voice from above, talking through Claire's phone. "Hey, did you guys drop the phone or something?" I would have screamed out and would have assuredly been heard through the walls if not the phone, but before I could open my mouth, someone else opened theirs.
"Oh, yeah. Sorry, can you hear me now?"
It was Claire's voice, heard from up on the roof, speaking as clearly and as calmly as ever. Claire, who had just been snatched up by some nightmare-sent hand before she even had a chance to scream. A barely audible sound and the sudden absence of Derek's voice, which had been in mid-response to her question, indicated to me that the call had been taken off speaker. Claire's voice continued to be heard, and none of her responses even hinted that she had been seized by some night-lurking thing. Perhaps a bit too late, I realized that I wasn't hearing Claire at all. It was the creature that had been speaking, perfectly mimicking Claire's voice. My fear evolved into heart-quickening terror at this realization. I felt dizzy, having come to that dark conclusion, and still the horror of that night hadn't yet peaked. From up above, I heard Claire's voice ask if she and I could come over to their room. A moment later it said,
"Great, we'll be right over."
The call was audibly ended after that. I heard movement from up above, a sort of shuffling and a subsequent groaning from the structure as if it had been relieved of a great burden. The sounds of movement, issuing from something massive, continued along the roof until they crossed over towards the roofing of the other room. They suddenly quieted thereon, the creature not wanting the boys to suspect its true nature. It hadn't cared if I heard, it knew that I already knew. It took a moment for my paralyzing fear to subside before I ran to the wall. I had considered and dismissed the idea of calling them with my phone in the few steps it had taken. They might not have answered soon enough. I pounded on the wall, shouting through the plaster for them to not answer the door. But coinciding with my beatings on the wall, I heard something calmly knock on their door. Marcus mumbled something, which seemed to have been directed at me, but neither properly responded. The walls seemed capable of blocking more sound than I had originally guessed. I stopped shouting, only so I could hear what was going on. It felt like my body had been drained of all its vitality when I heard the door open. There were no other sounds for a moment, and then I heard Marcus's voice, still close to the wall, call out to Derek, who had presumably opened the door. I then heard the stresses of their bed springs being relieved, and the footfalls of Marcus as he approached the door. I cried out for him not to go. He didn't respond, and a few moments later, I heard their door softly close. I listened with my ear pressed so closely against the wall that it hurt. For a while, I heard soft sounds throughout the room, things being picked up and set down, sometimes in different locations. Noises that seemed to suggest the room's occupant was examining things, as if the environment was new to them. With my ear pressed so closely, the sudden knock on the wall, though gentle, sounded like a hammer strike. I jerked away from the wall and unintentionally screamed, confirming, if it had had any doubt, my presence within the room. Panic and terror drove me away from the wall. and to the nightstand between the beds, where I snatched up the car keys, thankfully still in our room. And then I headed for the door. I threw it open, wincing in instinctive anticipation of some far-reaching three-fingered hand coming down to seize me. But the view ahead showed only the moonlit parking lot. I stepped out, looking quickly to each side. To my left, the wing of the building along which the majority of the motel rooms lay. To my right, the guys' room, and 3 others beyond theirs, with the reception area its separate subsection of the wing. The door to the hotel room was open. In a moment of self-acknowledged cowardice, I immediately decided that all my friends were dead, and that they'd at least want me to survive. Having come to this conclusion with pathetic quickness, I sprinted to the car without a moment's hesitation. I heard a noise behind me, but judged that it had come from within their room. Too far a distance, even for the searching arm. When the headlights illuminated the front of the building immediately before me, I saw something that has given me the darkest, most vivid nightmares ever since. The hand, and the freakishly elongated arm to which it was attached, was still within the room of Marcus and Derek, probing the space for who knows what. In the white light of the headlights, it was a sickly dark green, like the wet skin of some hellish crocodile. In the earlier moments of mind-consuming fright, where mere survival took cognitive precedence, I hadn't thought to really envision the rest of the entity. Sat crouched atop the building, although I don't know how the obviously and minimally maintained structure supported it. It was enormous, a gargantuan, gargoyle-like fiend. It had one massive arm, the hand of which had plunged into the room immediately below it. Other arms at seemingly random placements along the opposite side of its body, even up to its hideously elongated neck, waved through the air, their hands opening and closing, grasping at nothing. They all did so in unison, as if mimicking the motions of the primary hand that investigated the room beneath. Its head was obscured amidst the gloom that had gone untouched by the headlights and the moon. I saw only a vague, possibly horn shape, proportionately large, angled downward at the building. From what I could see in the darkness, it had 2 forelegs and 4 hind legs, all similar to that great arm in size. Even though every nerve in my body screamed not to, I drove uncomfortably close to the building. It was only for a moment. I wasn't willing to see whether or not that colossal, snatching fiend could pick up a car with its crane-sized arm. The creature remained totally preoccupied with the room. When I sped past, it withdrew the arm, and for a moment I thought it would actually attempt to snatch or strike the vehicle. But instead, the hand entered the room Claire and I had occupied. I saw only a glimpse of Marcus and Derek's room, but it was enough to leaden my foot and send me speeding hazardously across the parking lot, barely dodging the other cars as I fled. Within the room, on the floor near each other, were 2 crumpled forms the size of a basketball. Despite the speed at which I had passed the room and the inconsistent illumination therein, I recognized the colors of the clothing Marcus and Derek had worn. Those 2 hyper-compressed objects, almost perfectly spherical objects, had once been my friends. I cleared the parking lot and turned onto the highway, but some morbid pull turned my attention to the rear-view mirror. Even as I sped away, putting miles between myself and the motel, I could never seem to remove from the mirror the image of that thing perched atop the building, juggling their crushed bodies. I won't go back there, even if the police demand that I show them the exact area myself. I'm sorry, friends, but I won't end up like that.
For context, I'm a middle-aged man who lives on the outskirts of Parbold, a small English village. My house is the only one on a long, winding country road, but it does have a bus stop. From my bedroom window, I can see it on the other side of the road. It's quite handy, really. I never miss the morning bus to work, and I know the schedule by heart. That's why I was bewildered when I first noticed at 3:17 a.m. the bus on Saturday, the 14th of October. It woke me up, actually. I'm a light sleeper. I sat upright in my bed, twisted my body around, propped myself up on my knees, and gingerly inched the curtains open. The old lamppost on my road illuminated an ominous, fully gray, non-branded, single-decker bus. There was no interior lighting. I couldn't see a driver or any passengers. Now, this was obviously bizarre. Buses don't show up at that time in the morning, not in this country. Not in any town or city I know, anyway. Still, I assumed, as any person would, that times were changing. It seemed like a good idea. A bus for those who missed the last train home after a night out, perhaps. But that still didn't entirely make sense because very few people use my bus stop. It's a 10-minute walk from here to anywhere. I checked the schedule. Nothing. There was a bus at 11:07 p.m. on Friday evening, and there shouldn't have been another one until 6:05 a.m. Saturday morning. I watched the vehicle pull away and perhaps considered that it wasn't a public bus. Maybe it was a hired coach. It seemed like a reasonable explanation. I put it out of my mind and went back to sleep. However, it returned the next morning, and it continued to do so for weeks. Again, I checked the schedule. Still, no mention of a 3:17 a.m. bus. I called the council, and they assured me that it wasn't a public bus. They said that I could contact the local authorities to report any suspicious activity. So I rang the police. They didn't care. They passed me over to some civil department with a forgettable name. That department passed me over to another department. Nobody was concerned. It became clear that each person I contacted just wanted me to tire of the whole thing and stop bothering them. And I gave up on seeking help. But I couldn't give up on my quest for an answer. I started making notes. The bus always arrived at exactly 3:17 a.m. It would linger for approximately 30 seconds. Nobody ever departed or boarded the vehicle. I took a picture of it and posted it on various forums. Nobody could identify the origin of the faceless gray bus, but one comment did stand out. I remember a user telling me that I should sell my house and move. They said that the bus was there for me. More importantly, they said that I shouldn't, under any circumstances, board it. Well, that seemed like a rather obvious piece of advice. I wasn't planning on boarding a sketchy unlisted bus in the pitch-black hours of the morning. But everything changed on the 20th of November. The bus arrived on time, 3:17 a.m., I knelt on my bed and peeked at it through the curtain as it rounded the corner. Something was different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Once the vehicle had rolled to a complete stop, I heard it. Somebody on the bus was screaming. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Silence followed, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew I heard that scream. I watched the bus and waited. 30 seconds passed. A lot of time passed. When I finally peeled my eyes from the road to check my phone, it was 3:29 a.m. The bus hadn't moved. The world outside was still eerily quiet. I reattached myself to reality and started dialing 999. The call kept failing, and then I saw that I had no signal. None. I usually had signal at the house. I was freaking out, so I got up to turn on my bedroom light. Nothing. I flicked the switch back and forth. No power. The story was the same throughout the house. I was about to head out to the fuse box, but I looked out my living room window to see a blackened world. The lamppost was dead. It had to be a power cut. That was when I finally understood, for the first time in my 10 years of solitary living, that I was truly isolated. I had no neighbors, no friends, no family. I was all alone. The gravity of the situation dawned on me. I would have to leave the house. My self-preservation instinct was to stay indoors, but I couldn't ignore the disembodied scream that had echoed through the night. I knew it had come from the bus. I knew I couldn't live with myself if I were to dismiss it. Armed with a winter coat and a wind-up torch, I bravely ventured into the night, locking my door behind me. I tentatively strolled down my front path, stopping at the gate to cast the torchlight on the other side of the road. It revealed the gray, stationary, seemingly abandoned bus. There were no signs of life. Everything was so quiet. I swore to myself that I could hear my heartbeat in my eardrums. I swung the creaky gate open and began to cross the road, futilely attempting to steady my quaking knees. My torch wobbled in my shaky left hand, so I clasped my wrist with my right hand. I shone the light into the windows of the parked vehicle. There was definitely no driver, but it was an elevated coach, so I couldn't see whether there were any passengers. I walked around the front of the vehicle, summoning the courage to enter it. When I reached the other side of the bus, I stood still. I tried to control my breathing. I eyed the doors for what seemed an eternity, and I felt my entire body clench. The doors opened. My torchlight still wasn't revealing a driver. I couldn't see or hear anyone. I thought, for a brief moment, of that internet stranger who told me not to board the bus, but I couldn't get the scream out of my head. My gut told me that somebody was in danger. I stepped onto the bus and started to climb the stairs. The doors closed. I held the torch before me as if it were a weapon, and I gradually climbed the next set of stairs to the elevated passenger platform. I spent several seconds on each step, savoring what I felt could be my final moments on Earth. Then I illuminated the passenger area before me. I half expected to see nothing. No, there was somebody on the bus. The young girl was sitting in the middle seat on the back row. Her head was in her palms. She was crying. I couldn't see her face. "Are you okay?" I asked timidly. No answer. So I started to walk forwards. I didn't know whether there was anyone else on board, but I couldn't leave her. Once I was standing only a few yards in front of her, I knelt down in the aisle. "Are you okay?" I asked the second time. The girl's crying abruptly ceased, but she didn't lift her head from her hands. "You shouldn't have boarded the bus," she replied. My torch died. I furiously wound the lever at the side, but it didn't spring back to life. The girl and I had been plunged into darkness. Then I heard the bus doors open. I slowly turned my head to face the front of the bus. I could hear the sound of low, guttural breathing. It was followed by clunking footsteps. Dim moonlight shone through the front window, but it was sufficient to display a hulking figure at the other end of the aisle. A black specter with gangly limbs was moving toward us. He was hunched forward, and his elongated arms dragged along the tops of the seats. He was too tall and too wide to fit in the aisle. I turned to face the girl. She'd lifted her head from her hands. I could barely see her. I could barely hear her. "This is the last stop," she whispered. "I was really hoping you wouldn't board. I wanted more time." Before I could even comprehend what was happening, I felt an icy limb coil itself around my ankle. It yanked and I fell. My nose connected with the floor on the aisle and I heard something crack. I thought that was it. I thought that was the end. But I looked up to see the demonic creature coil its other limb around the girl's neck. It hoisted her from her seat. She screamed as she was lifted toward the indistinguishable figure in the aisle. I couldn't really see what had happened in the darkness, but I'll never forget the sound her body made when it was consumed by the black entity. It sounded like leaves crunching beneath walking boots. I'd almost entirely lost my sense of reality at this point, but some vestige of survival instinct persisted in my fractured mind. I twisted onto my back and looked down at my ankle. I couldn't really see what I was doing in the dark. I just knew I had to act. So, with my free foot, I stomped on the creature's limb, and I stomped as hard as humanly possible. The demon, who had been devouring the poor girl, unleashed an inhuman wail. It pierced my eardrums and shattered every window on the bus. The limb retracted from my ankle and returned to the shadowy being. I seized my opportunity. Catapulting to my feet, I spun around and lunged for the now glassless back window of the bus. Clinging to the frame of the window for dear life, I took one last look at the dark entity that was hurtling towards me. Then I dropped to my feet on the road. I sprinted away from the bus. Adrenaline fueled me onwards. I didn't look back. I just kept running. At the speed I traveled, I think it only took me a few minutes to reach the warm and welcoming lights of civilization. I looked at my phone and cried when I saw that I had service. I booked a taxi. I wanted the furthest possible destination. I chose Manchester, then I took the first train to London. For the past couple of weeks, I've been living in a hotel. I know I was a little late, but I finally took the advice of that online stranger. I moved away. I moved far away. I don't go outside at night, and I definitely don't look out of the window after 3 a.m.
Chapter 1. Just an Illusion. How in the hell did I get here? Oh yeah, I was with Sarah Painter, my secretary, and her sexy body got me here. Looks like the same ceiling in the same place we always come to. I always look up at the ceiling fan taking its rotations and feeling the pounding of another headache from drinking too much. Looking at the fan too long is making me sick. I rolled over and sat on the edge of the bed, not looking over at Sarah. I put my face in my hands and rubbed my temples. This headache needed to go away. I dropped my hands and stood up, turning to look at Sarah once more. The body in the bed rolled over and sat up, dropping the sheet and exposing her naked breasts. Startled, I jumped. Jesus, what the... Jane? I rubbed my eyes to be sure I wasn't dreaming. There sat my lovely and beautiful wife, Jane, smiling. You look like you've just seen a ghost, my love. Are you okay? Yes, I'm fine. I must have had a bad dream, I said, turning to go to the bathroom. Damn, I must be going crazy. Hell, I know I was with Sarah last night. How in the hell did Jane get here? What time is it? Where am I exactly? I splashed water in my face, hoping its cold shock would bring me to reality. Is this a dream? I started to feel dizzy and the hangover wave was overcoming me. The room around me was spinning and my vision blurred. I stumbled and almost dropped to the floor as I grabbed the sink and held on tight. I regained my balance and started to go back into the room. Damn, whiskey. I walked back to the bed and, well, it wasn't a hotel room at all. It was my bedroom. Jane's and my bedroom. We shared it for the past 10 years, but there hadn't been much action in it for a while. But I thought I was in a motel with Sarah last night. What happened to Sarah? I ambled down the steps of our fancy brick home in the burbs to have breakfast, still wondering what in the hell the whiskey did to me. Blackout on my feet? Didn't remember? Someone slipping a drug in my shots of whiskey? Sorry I came in a little late last night. Guys from the office wanted to have a few drinks. Got to drinking some whiskey and must have had a hard time remembering getting home, I lied. Well, I hope you did remember what we did last night, Jane said, smiling and looking coy. We haven't had sex like last night in years. You were good. Oh, so good, Mark, Jane said, moving closer to me to kiss me on the neck. Well, glad we got to share some closeness. Yes, it had been a while. There's something... I hesitated and thought better of bringing up Sarah. Maybe Jane was trying, and maybe I could get back to a monogamous relationship. Maybe this was bad timing, and Sarah had just been on my mind too much. Now I had a problem. I needed to talk to Sarah. Saving my relationship with Jane, or dumping Jane and taking up with Sarah? It was my burning question for the past 2 years. There's something what, dear? Oh, nothing, just nothing. Something I thought about for us to do tonight. Maybe have dinner and see a show? I'd like to go out, I really would, Jane replied, setting the plate of bacon and eggs in front of me at the table. Okay, look, we'll go to the 7 o'clock show. There are a few things I need to do at the office this afternoon, and I will be home by 4. Maybe we can do last night all over again. You know, a repeat performance? Jane smiled a crooked smile, and her eyes had a faraway look. She reached down and rubbed my chest, making me try to remember just what we did do last night. I got up and Jane grabbed me and forcefully kissed me, almost too hard. She forced my lower lip against my teeth, causing my lip to bleed. Wow, you kissed me pretty hard there, I said, as I held my finger to my lip and looking at the drop of bright red blood on my finger. Jane grabbed my hand, holding up to her ruby lips, and stuck my finger in her mouth and pulled it back out, licking the blood off my finger. Her eyes were glazed and distant, like she was under a spell. She came back to earth and took a napkin and dabbed the rest of the blood until it stopped. Don't be late, she said. I have a surprise for you tonight. It will be perfect. I didn't know whether to feel aroused or to be frightened. Both feelings had my adrenaline going. So much so, I almost forgot about Sarah. Where was Sarah? Hopefully at the office? The scene last night was almost too crazy, much like a dream and one I wish I could forget. But I was with Sarah. I remember her fragrance. It was unique. One she told me she bought just for me. I needed to get to the office. I kissed Jane gently on the neck she exposed to me and then told her I was going to work. I mentioned to her I would be home before 4. Maybe Jane was snapping out of her year-long funk. Maybe she was ready to try at our marriage she knew was slipping away from us. Then there was Sarah. I turned to head up to our bathroom to shower. On the way, I passed the hall closet and turned to go up the stairs. I thought I smelled Sarah, her fragrance, the perfume she had bought just for me. The fragrance just couldn't be Sarah. We weren't here. We were in a motel. Maybe her fragrance was still on me. I needed the shower before Jane recognized the fragrance was not hers. Chapter 2. The Burning Question. As I drove to work, I couldn't stop thinking of her fragrance and how it filled my nostrils as I went from the hall to the steps leading up to our bedroom. Was Sarah in my house last night? Certainly not. I would surely not have tried to bring her here. Surely it was just her fragrance on me. I had cheated with her last night at the motel after having drinks together. Yes, the fragrance surely came from our little tryst. I should tell Jane, but I am such a coward. I pulled into the parking lot and felt the butterflies moving around in my stomach. I was working in this office for 10 years now, and there was no reason to be this nervous. But it was all about Sarah, my secretary since I started here. I wondered what kind of looks she would give me, what I needed to tell her about maybe breaking it off between us and giving my marriage one more shot. Or would I just keep on with Sarah and say nothing until this all blew up in everyone's face? I pulled into my parking spot designated just for Mark Jenkins, CEO. I parked the car and got my briefcase and keys, locking the door behind me, and walked to the office. Heading into the front office, I didn't see Sarah, but I just thought maybe she would be back putting papers on my desk. I walked back to my office, sharing the usual greetings of the morning to those I saw. When I got there, I saw nothing of Sarah. I went back to the front counter and asked Judy Branca, the receptionist, if she heard from Sarah. She said Sarah called in sick. She sounded bad, Judy added, So bad, in fact, her voice just didn't sound like her at all. Okay, there's a pretty good bug going around right now, I replied. I turned and headed back to my office. Sarah was rarely sick and rarely ever called in. Well, she usually would call in to me, not Judy. She didn't sound sick last night. Something just didn't feel right, but I promised Jane I would be home early, so I better get to work and get some things done. There were just too many things I couldn't recall about last night. I had to find out from the beginning just what happened. I sat down and started to work. Jane Jenkins had plans for her husband tonight, plans her husband, Mark Jenkins, would never forget. She felt Mark's detachment from her, and she didn't like it. Last night was just the beginning, and biting his lip when she kissed him this morning was an indication. She would show him what she was capable of all along and make him regret he ignored her for so long. She knew she had this hunger inside her. Last night was just the beginning of beating herself, and she would feed off the very same hunger. A hunger for more than sex. Something much more. 2 years ago, they fell into a bad rut. She no longer seemed to be interesting to Mark, and he often went out at night, seeking other ways to have fun. It might have been drinks with the guys from the office or chasing other women, but Jane was no fool and saw their romance fading into the woodwork. She wanted to do something about their relationship. But last night? Well, last night was different. She no longer sat back, sulking in her own pity. Jane thought it was time to take some action. Her actions last night not only stimulated her into coming out of her funk, but her actions also titillated her sexually. Jane liked how anger and rage made her feel. She was gaining something she had lost long ago to her CEO husband. It was power. Mark stole it from her long ago, never realizing she had her own potential within. He did it on purpose because he was selfish and wanted her to think he was necessary for her to exist. Tonight she would wield power he had never seen before. I worked for an hour, mostly with the distraction of Sarah on my mind. I thought better of it, but I have to text her, just to know she was okay. Are you okay? I pushed send. A minute, then 2 minutes, then my phone pinged. Yes, I am fine, just a bad cold. Good, I was worried. I have something I have to talk with you about. I pushed send again. If it was about last night, you were so good. Our sex together has never been better. You were so good. Have to go out with Jane tonight. Can we meet tomorrow? My phone pinged again. Sure, but don't have too much fun. Save your best for me. I put the phone down on my desk and covered my eyes with both hands, pressing against my eyeballs to make the pain go away. The hangover was still pretty bad, but I had one more day to make a decision. It had to be one or the other, Jane or Sarah. I couldn't keep this up any longer. I had to choose. Jane or Sarah was the burning question. Chapter 3. Date Night. I left her home around 3:30 in the afternoon. I had not talked to Sarah, and the temptation to call her was there, but I resisted as I wasn't too far from the house. The text and the fact she texted back to me had to do for now. I pulled into my driveway at the same time I had told Jane I would be home. When I got inside, the music was playing upstairs and I assumed Jane was up there getting ready. Honey, I'm home, I called out, setting my briefcase on the Parsons bench by the coat rack in the hall. Hey there, she replied, looking down to me from above as she looked more remarkable in just a towel than I can ever remember, her tan body wrapped in just a white towel. I thought you might want to have a little peek, as she stood there facing me and opening her white towel to reveal to me her naked self, and then quickly covering back up. I know I can be such a tease, but I just had to give you some indication of what our date night will be like tonight. Jane licked her lips and smiled. All I can say to how you look is, well, wow, I exclaimed as I scurried up the steps to meet her. I kissed her, and she threw her arms around my neck. Her wet towel rubbing against my white shirt belied the heat coming from her tan and naked skin. Jane had never been this hot for the past year. I barely recall anything this steamy in our 10 years of marriage. I felt so hot. I barely felt my cut lip from this morning. I was starting to sweat. Jane pulled away gently and looked into my eyes with a look I am sure I never encountered from her before. It was mesmerizing. "You don't want us to miss dinner now, do you?" she asked. "Of course not. I'll jump in the shower in just a second, but first I need one more look at you. Your face, it's so stunning and beautiful. Your smile is one I haven't seen in such a long time." We walked back into the bedroom together and I held her close to kiss her once more. This question, this burning question in my mind. I know what we have been through these past years. Is it really going to change? Is Jane really coming around? Is this what I really want? And is going to change on Monday? I shook off the thoughts. I hurried into the shower, toweling off quickly and dressing in a casual style, a white open collar shirt, a pair of black slacks, and a black sport coat. Jane was already dressed and looking gorgeous in a short black dress with the hemline well above the knee and a necklace I gave her many Christmases ago. She never looked this stunning to me since our wedding day. We left the house, locked the door, and drove to our favorite restaurant, Montalto's. Jane held my hand most of the way, and, at times, she seemed to almost squeeze it too hard. I took it to mean she was wanting our relationship to work. Maybe she felt this chance was one she didn't want to screw up. I don't know, but I was liking this Jane. We were seated at a table facing the lighted, busy street. The white lights shining on Jane's face through the front window of the restaurant gave her an appearance of pure elegance. Her face seemed to be the one I married 10 years ago. She looked so alive and vibrant. We had appetizers, an entree, and had just finished dessert over very stimulating conversation when the light changed from bright white to an angry red. Must have been a police car or ambulance, but suddenly I saw something different in her eyes as I paid the check with a card and waited for the server to return. "Jane, are you okay?" I asked, laying my hand over the top of hers. She instinctively pulled her hand away from mine, something she had done a lot of lately. "Look, if you don't feel well, we can leave if you like." "I'm fine, really. What makes you think I'm not okay? I'm just making plans in my head for you, dear. Plans we have never participated in during our whole marriage. Sexy, powerful plans." "It was a look on your face. You didn't look happy." "Oh, but I am, dear. I'm happy just being here with you," she said, smiling and showing teeth, somehow oddly reflecting the red flashing light on her white teeth, making them appear, well, bloody. This was a far cry from when she had nothing on but a towel upstairs in our home earlier. She leaned towards me, her bright red teeth glistening with what appeared to be blood. I cringed but caught myself. I'm sure it's just the guilt I'm feeling about Sarah, I thought. Jane certainly was not capable of anything mean or vicious. I kept thinking how this whole affair I was having with Sarah wasn't fair to Jane. I either had to tell her about Sarah or just concentrate on being a better husband to Jane. Red teeth. Bloody teeth. Uh-oh. Am I really here, or is this just another illusion? What's happening? I quickly erased the thoughts and leaned in closer to Jane, smelling her fragrance. I immediately got a lump in my throat. "Let's go home," I whispered to her softly. "I'm feeling something very powerful for you, and I don't want to lose the moment." "Yes, let's do. I'm feeling very warm, and the movie can wait for another day. I'm getting downright hot for you, my handsome CEO. I have something planned for you. You're going to love it," Jane said with the voice of an angel. My thoughts were laser-focused on Sarah's perfume I smelled on Jane. The fragrance brought a lump in my throat. Surely it was just my olfactory sense playing with my mind. Or was it? Then I thought once again. Red teeth. Red teeth. Jane rubbed my arm all the way home, moving up to my shoulder, then my neck, and then rubbing my thigh, close to my crotch, She leaned over and kissed my ear. I was getting to the point where we needed to be home. I was feeling Jane's hunger and sensing some urgency in her. Maybe Jane was wanting me too. Possibly we could go back to the early years in our marriage where we didn't make love, but consumed each other. Was this really happening? We walked from the garage into our lovely home and headed up the steps to our bedroom. Jane immediately stepped out of her black dress and went to the bathroom to fill our jacuzzi tub and place some candles around it. She came back out of the bathroom as water continued to run in the jacuzzi. Jane next turned on some music on her home speaker system. Jazz, very sultry and mood-enhancing. Jane had maintained her body over the years and she looked so fit and tan. It must have been something I had ignored for a while during my affair with Sarah. How did we get this far off and not come back full circle? Does she know about Sarah and she is now trying to win me back? Surely she doesn't know. She looks so good. I quickly undressed too, and Jane, still in her underwear and bra, went downstairs to get us a drink. While she was gone, I caught a lingering smell of the perfume again, the one Sarah wore the last time we were together. I know this can't be, but the fragrance smelled very real, and it was on Jane. My nostrils were not playing tricks on me. It was totally entrenched in my mind. How could Jane be wearing Sarah's perfume? Suddenly, Jane reappeared with 2 drinks in hand. She was totally naked now and headed right past me to the bathroom. She set the 2 drinks on the edge of the tub and turned off the water. She turned to look at me and smiled. "Well, aren't you going to join me?" I quickly took off my boxers and headed to the tub and slipped into the hot water with bubbles on top from the jacuzzi jets. Jane got in and sat opposite me. Her red lips were inviting as I took a few sips of my scotch and Jane a long swig of her wine. She raised her eyebrows as she looked deeply into my eyes. "So, how do you like date night so far, my handsome husband?" "I'm loving it," I replied, setting my drink down on the tub's edge. I leaned in close to her, wanting to kiss her, the warm water stimulating my whole body and the jacuzzi jets massaging us both. She leaned in close, kissing me gently at first and then even more passionately. The kiss seemed at least a minute long. "The perfume you are wearing, is it new?" I asked, taking another long drink of the scotch. "Yes, I bought it just for you this morning while you were at work. Do you like it?" Jane whispered, exposing her neck to me, and I leaned in to kiss her. "I love it. It's intoxicating," I said, rubbing the inner parts of her thighs. Sarah's perfume. I took my hands from under the water and brushed her bangs from her eyes. I knew the burning question would haunt me, but I had to decide. I couldn't keep this charade going on forever. It was now or never. I had to make this decision soon. Jane looked perfect tonight, and it seems I need to know this new Jane, one I don't remember, or in fact never was. Something had changed, and so far, it all seemed to be for the better. "Let's go to the bed," she cooed, and in an instant we both hurried out of the tub to dry off. I felt a sudden dizziness when I got up, but just passed it off as the scotch taking effect and being in the hot water. I walked to the bed and sat down on the edge. Jane slid over from her side of the bed and sitting up, massaging my neck and shoulders. I was feeling more than a drink's effect. I began to see the room spinning, and then the lights seemed to go on and off. What is going on? I turned to Jane, wanting to see something in her eyes that could help me. "Jane, I think something is wrong. Maybe you should call 911, I said hurriedly as the spinning was becoming more pronounced. The whirling of the room's furniture, looking like a tilt-a-whirl, came rushing at me from all sides. I closed my eyes, yet heard Jane's voice. "Sure, baby, sure," she said as she grabbed her phone. "Hello, 911? I think my husband is having a heart attack." Jane quickly blurted out the address and set the phone down. My world was getting black, and I thought in this very moment I was dying. Chapter 4. The Burning Question Answered. I know I was hearing it in a dream. The voices were clear. A man's voice. "Now that should about do it." My mind was foggy and I tried to lift my head off the pillow to look around and focus on what was blurry. I was struggling to open my eyes and I couldn't get the blurry images to become clear. Something was on my hands and legs. Was I in the hospital? I tried to move, but I couldn't. There was something pulling on my legs and arms. I tried to fight harder, but my body was too sluggish to do anything. I looked over to my left and the smell wafting through my nostrils. Perfume? No, this just couldn't be. It was the smell of the same perfume. Sarah's perfume? Jane's? Where in the hell was I? There was Jane, sitting up in bed, her naked breasts exposed. This was déjà vu. "You were so good last night," Jane said, noticing my look of disbelief and horror. "Why, you look like you've just seen a ghost," she chuckled. "You don't remember, do you? You do remember date night and taking me to dinner, don't you? And how you took a nice jacuzzi with me when we got home? You wanted to go to bed with me, but you thought you were ill. You wanted me to call 911. Remember?" "But you did. I heard your voice telling them our address. I heard you." "Yes, dear, you did, but I pretended to dial. I never called 911. It was only the effect of the sleeping pills in your drink making you pass out, and now, here you are, my love. If you still wanted the sex, I guess it's too bad as you're a little tied up right now." Jane threw her head back and laughed loudly at her joke. "Jane, what's happening? What's going on?" "Oh, just here to see if you can answer the burning question, my love." "What burning question?" "Oh, don't play dumb, Mark. I knew you and Sarah had a thing going. Jeff here told me all about it. Seems he followed you and Sarah to your little trysts at those seedy motels. I didn't believe him at first. Then he actually took me there and removed all my doubt." "Jeff Painter? Sarah's husband, Jeff?" I asked. I started to get my feeling back in my body and looked down to see all I had on was a towel laying across my groin area and my hands and feet were tied to the bedposts. I was still too sluggish to struggle. I felt helpless and began to feel sweat running down my forehead into my eyes, making them burn. "Don't look so surprised, Mark. I followed you and Sarah to those places. Jane never believed me, but I took her with me once to follow you and Sarah. She didn't believe me until I showed her what a prick you were," Jeff said clearly and with an edge of hate in his voice. "So we teamed up that night, drugged you, and I went home to see Sarah and confront her." "So, where's Sarah?" I asked, looking at Jane and then back at Jeff. "What did you do with her?" "Oh, she's here. She's just fine. In fact, she's right here in the room with you," Jane said, getting up from the bed and putting on her robe. "It's your burning question, isn't it, Mark? It was going to be the discussion at some point, right? You telling me how wonderful she was to you, and you were going to leave me for her?" Jane said, her voice gaining in volume with each word. I looked around for Sarah. There was no Sarah to be found. "Mark, you are so unaware, just like you were with me, never focusing on me, looking all around me until you found someone better, someone who could meet your needs. Well, it's just too bad you can't have her. See, the answer to your burning question of whether it's me or Sarah is you get neither. Looking all around for your poor Sarah, but there she is right next to you. Look, Mark," she yelled, pointing to her left. I finally turned my head to the side far enough to see the body, wrapped in cellophane and tied to a chair, the legs sticking straight out from rigor mortis. The face, so blue and so lifeless, was Sarah's face. Cuts on her face and dried blood showing through the cellophane. The needles pricking my skin at the sight of dead Sarah wrapped in cellophane made my heart skip a beat. "What did you both do?" I questioned, trying to free myself from the ropes tying me to the bed. "It was easy once you got home," Jane said. "I drugged your water you keep on the nightstand. You drank it, then you fell asleep. The sleeping pills made your hangover the next day so oppressive. It is the plan I told you about at dinner last night. Quite a plan, don't you think, Mark? Therefore, you woke up with Jane, not Sarah. It was the reason why you were confused when you woke up, Jeff said, grinning with evil in his eyes. Thought you were supposed to wake up in bed with my wife. Instead, you woke up in your own bed with your own wife. You were so disoriented you had no idea where you were. It was a nice plan. I did kill Sarah at home and then brought her here. I confronted her about you, Mark, and she tried to lie. It was one thing to catch you both, but I just couldn't take the lies anymore. I was putting your affair with my wife to an end. But I texted her. She texted back. She was still alive, I exclaimed, beginning to sweat profusely at the thought I would be the next to die. I texted you back, my love, Jane said. I had Sarah's phone. Jeff brought it to me when you left for work. It was just to keep you in the game long enough. I am much too weak to hold you or tie you up. Here's where my new partner, Jeff, worked into the plan. He did a great job of securing you to the bed, tying Sarah's dead and stiff body to the chair, and finally, well, I was going to let him kill you for me. But you see, at this point, I feel the strength you wouldn't give me. The fact you always thought I was weak and you could have me do anything as long as it suited you. Only what you wanted. Well, I have the power over you now. There's nothing you can do. If only you could have seen it years ago. If only you would have loved me completely and never strayed. If only you would have given me the power and let me love you, I wouldn't have had to do this. Jane walked over to Jeff, who handed her the gleaming, long-bladed knife. She gripped the handle as Jeff had told her to. It was the same way he gripped the knife when he had killed Sarah Friday night. Now, she was about to do something she thought she would never be able to do. Until I cheated on her. She stood over me, staring down with her smile. Red teeth. I was fearful, and Jane could see it in my eyes. It was exactly what she wanted. I smelled her fragrance. Sarah's fragrance. I looked over at Sarah's cellophane-wrapped body, the blue face, and looked back to Jane. Please, no. Don't do this. Oh, now you want to make up to me? You know I love you. You just didn't respond to me, I stuttered. Jane mimicked me. You just quit wanting to sleep with me. You wanted all the power. You wanted to control me. Now hold still and it will be less painful. My body tried to move side to side away from the point of the knife slowly descending to my chest. She started to carve, and I gritted my teeth. I wanted to jump but was afraid she would plunge the knife into me. She carved out a J, and the drops of blood began to ooze out of the shallow cuts. There you go. J, that's for me. She carved out an S next, and more blood came oozing out. Of course, S is for Sarah. Now a question mark. Talking through clenched teeth, I asked her, why? Why the question mark? Jane smiled and answered, It's the burning question, right? Jane or Sarah, Sarah or Jane? Here, let me answer it for you, dear Mark. The answer is neither. You get neither, you asshole. Her voice had elevated to nearly a scream. Jeff has me now, and you could have had me. Once I knew you were cheating on me, I never wanted you back. I just wanted to kill you. I wanted the power. I needed the power. You were too self-absorbed to give it to me, so I'm taking it now. No going back, no starting over. You get nothing, Mark, except what you have coming to you. Finish him. Do it now, Jeff bellowed as he moved closer to see this with his own eyes. Look, you forgot the point of the question mark. How ironic. The question mark. Jeff laughed hideously, and I saw nothing but pure and unadulterated evil in his eyes. He stepped forward, putting his evil face right in front of my own. I see, Jeff. I left it undone, Jane said, as she drove the blade deep into Mark's stomach, finishing off the point of the question mark in dramatic fashion. She twisted the blade and removed it slowly from Mark's abdomen. Blood was flowing freely now, and I couldn't breathe. I was losing blood quickly, and there wasn't anyone who could possibly hear me if I screamed, as the music had been turned up very loud. "Goodbye, Mark," Jane said as she handed the knife over to Jeff, who ended Mark's life, cutting his throat from ear to ear. Blackness. Mark was no more. Chapter 5. The Drive. 4 hours later, the bodies were loaded in the trunk, wrapped in cellophane and sheets. 2 cold bodies of the cheaters needed to be together. Jeff drove and Jane looked out of the window. The old road leading to the wooded area, which held an old abandoned farmhouse, was made of gravel and was slightly muddy due to the earlier rain. The dumping would be easy. They arrived at the spot where the well was a few yards from the old house. Jeff knew where the well was, as he had scouted this out long before. The well was deep and the bodies were easily hoisted by Jane and Jeff. The bodies seemed to float in slow motion until they reached darkness. Then the 2 bodies hit the bottom of the well with a loud thud, making Jane jump a little. With very little fanfare, they both got to the car and cleaned everything with bleach as to leave no trace of DNA. They headed for the car wash and then the motel, the same one they caught Sarah and Mark. They showered and changed clothes, and within 1 hour were headed back to the car to go to the airport. Sure, they would be seen on the motel security cam, but they'd be long gone before anyone would notice they were gone. They destroyed their cell phones and had burners ready to replace their old phones. There would be no way they could be tracked. The authorities may find their destination, but Jeff and Jane would have changed identities before the authorities could ever track them to Brazil. They arrived in an hour, and Jeff asked Jane if she remembered her passport. She nodded her head yes, and they were on the plane within the hour. Soon, they would be landing in Brazil. It was a temporary stay, as they would have to be on the move. Soon, someone would be tracking them when Mark and Sarah didn't show up for work. They would manage to move around and avoid detection, as Jeff had inherited enough money from his father to keep them moving and purchasing new identities. Jane, on the other hand, had emptied out all of Mark's accounts he had accumulated through hard work and becoming the CEO of his own company. They were going to be fine. At least Jeff thought so. The deed was done, and she and Jeff had avoided any detection for a month now. The news at home was Sarah, Jeff, Mark, and Jane had all come up missing. The news was reporting some type of spousal cheating may be involved. There were no signs of foul play. Up to this point, no bodies were found. Jeff and Jane's relationship never grew, and the sex was okay, but losing their respective spouses seemed to have some effect on their intimacy. Jane knew Jeff had given her the power she never possessed, and somehow their intimacy was due to something they had in common: dead spouses. Jeff felt like straying at times, but he knew what Jane was capable of doing. Maybe being unfaithful wasn't the thing to do right now. He was on his way back to the small bungalow they had purchased to stay hidden. Its location was high enough to see out into the street. Jane was at the window, looking out over the city of Rio de Janeiro. She noticed Jeff walking up the sidewalk when he was encountered by a young Brazilian prostitute. They talked for just a minute, and Jeff headed away from their bungalow and disappeared from Jane's sight. Later in the evening, when Jeff came in, he drank his bottle of water and slipped into bed with Jane. Jane never reacted, and Jeff thought he had possibly gotten away with it. In the morning, Jeff's head was pounding, and he opened his eyes and watched the ceiling fan turn around, almost making him more ill than he thought. He looked over and said, Andrea, I have to go now." He looked at the figure that sat up in bed, exposing her naked breasts. Jeff was waking up with Jane. "Jesus, Jane, what the—" "Oh my word, Jeff, you look like you've seen a ghost or something," Jane said, holding the knife the way Jeff had taught her. "Who is Andrea, Jeff? I saw you with the little whore. What is it with you men?" Jane stood, and the knife she held in her hand appeared from under the sheet. Jeff saw the point of the knife, the sharp, gleaming blade slowly descending to his chest in slow motion. There was nothing he could do. He was tied up to the bedposts. Jane had the power. the power Jeff had given to her. How ironic. Blood, darkness, money. Jeff was no more. Goodbye, Jeff.
There's nothing down there but bodies, you scummy bitch. That and the trail of blood you tracked this way. Maybe the dog ate her homework, too. You're done, Ginevra. They hauled her up, still screaming her head off, and dragged her to the waiting police car. They left their sirens off, courtesy for those in the town of Hell's Gulf still sleeping. But Ginevra's screams carried through the night regardless, all the way down to the station. In the shadows, watching the chaos unfurl, was a black greyhound. As the convoy of police and bystanders eventually disbanded and left the scene, he slunk away into the depths of the woods.
This world has no more left for you, my love,
he promised.
I think I'll be seeing you again soon.
The approaching summer break was a source of much excitement for the school children, but unbeknownst to them, none cherished it more than their teacher, Ginevra Sinclair, known to them as Miss Jenny. Soon would be gone the days of being cooped up in a stuffy classroom, sweating in a tweed dress under the impending heat. The afternoons became the worst as late spring dragged on, and by the end of Friday English, she was fidgeting almost as much as her pupils. The clock still read 5 minutes to go. She decided to show mercy.
Boys and girls, your attention, please.
The class set down their pencils and stared expectantly at her.
Remember, while you can't take those study guides you're working on into your exams next week, you'll have all weekend and before class to look them over. I'm glad to see you have all made progress. When's the English final?
Jacob asked, raising his hand.
Thursday, 10 a.m.
She rapped the blackboard dated May 24th, 1946 with her pointer.
As it says on the schedule right here. You doing anything fun this summer?
Said Jessica.
Might see my family up in North Carolina, but otherwise I'll be planning for next semester's lessons. Next semester?
Patrick piped up.
You're already thinking about next semester?
The class groaned and laughed in response.
Enjoy your summers while you can,
Miss Jenny said with a grin.
When you grow up, you'll find there's really no difference. I ain't coming back next semester,
John announced from the back of the room.
I'll be hoeing potatoes for the rest of my life. Oh, well, good for you then,
Miss Jenny commented.
The world needs potato farmers anyway. Will our exams be hard?
Susan asked softly from the front.
I'm afraid I can't speak for them,
Miss Jenny answered, shaking her head.
But to a bright bunch like you, as long as you know your study guides, I think they'll be cakewalks.
She offered them a smile, but the class merely gaped at her, quiet yet alert.
Well, if you're still unsure, there's a prayer I can teach you. One for the patron saint of exam taking. Golly, there's a patron saint for everything,
Patrick quipped.
Indeed. Ever since I was a little girl, I've been saying this prayer before any big exam I had to take. It never fails.
And with that, Miss Jenny turned to an empty space on the blackboard and wrote down the prayer from memory.
I'll leave this up for everyone during the exams,
she declared.
Let's go over it now.
And as one, the class recited it.
O great Saint Joseph of Cupertino, who while on earth did obtain from God the grace to be asked at your examination only the questions you knew, obtain for me a like favor in the examinations for which I am preparing. In return, I promise to make you known and cause you to be invoked. Through Christ our Lord, Saint Joseph of Cupertino, pray for us.
The walk home in the North Florida heat was no less demanding, and by the time Ginevra crossed the threshold into her home, she was yearning for a cool bath. But the bath would have to wait. There was a birthday to celebrate, and she had promised Richter she would not keep him waiting. Dressing into her old smock and an apron, she took out the steaks marinated in the refrigerator and set it on a platter of aluminum foil. Next came the green beans and the fingerling potatoes, seasoned with generous amounts of olive oil and salt. As she laid the veggies upon a sheet, she glanced at the picture frame sitting on the kitchen windowsill. The man behind the glass was giving a cheeky smile, posed at an off angle, his head tilted downward. At one point, that face had swept Ginevra off her feet, made her promise that she would spend the rest of her life with him and do all she could to make him happy. She turned the frame around. Now was not the time for grieving. Half an hour later, the table was set, and aromatic steam filled the entire house. Ginevra seated herself and, heart bursting with pride, gave a whistle. A sleek black greyhound bounded into the room and jumped onto the opposite chair. His jaws found the steak before his eyes did, and he devoured the slab in 2 bites, leaving the ring of vegetables untouched.
Happy birthday, Richter,
Ginevra crooned. The dog licked his chops and goggled at her, panting expectantly.
My special man's turned 4 today,
She continued, reaching over the table to scratch under his chin.
You've always been there for me, so loyal, so undemanding. Not like, well,
She pushed her late husband Aaron from her mind with a grimace.
you are the only one for me, dog. Don't you ever leave me. You won't ever leave me, will you?
Richter cocked his head but held his same silly grin.
I thought not.
Said Ginevra.
Now come on, I think there's some leftover cake in the fridge.
After the birthday meal, Ginevra let Richter out to do his business, then wandered upstairs for early bed. The long spring evening slowly darkened outside her window, a chorus of mole crickets serenading her. Finals week was a stressful time for her as well as her pupils. She figured she'd take all the time she could the weekend before to rest up and prepare. As she dozed off, Richter bounded into her room and sat by the edge of the mattress, giving her the puppy dog eyes. Ginevra grimaced at him. Richter wasn't allowed up on the bed despite him begging every night. But the steak dinner still lingered in the air, and Ginevra reminded herself it was a special night indeed.
Up,
She commanded, patting the empty space next to her. Richter jumped up, spraining the springs under his weight before circling and curling up. His paws were muddy from being outside, but Ginevra didn't care. It would wash out.
love you, boy.
She whispered, patting his head.
Don't know what I'd do without you. Go mad, I suspect. You're the only one for me.
Her heart gave a twinge as she scooted closer to him. Inspiration overwhelmed her, and she turned her gaze to the crucifix on the opposite wall.
I thank thee, Lord, for deliverance from my darkest times. I thank thee, Lord, for my greatest companion, the one and only of your creations to love me unconditionally. I thank thee for making Richter more than just a pet, for making him my best friend, the one most worthy of my dedication. You above all know how much I have to give. Bestow upon us many more memories, to many more years together. In Christ our Lord. Amen.
Richter emitted a contented rumble. Ginevra dozed off, feeling the most at peace since before those darkest times. The pressure of finals week fell upon her before she even arrived at the schoolhouse. Ginevra was an early bird out of necessity, not just for school, but ensuring Richter got his outside time before she left for the day. She had scarcely cracked the back door open before he jostled past her and bolted into the backyard, disappearing into the sandhill forest beyond. Ginevra was too tired and too rushed to call out to him. Richter always came back anyway. An hour later, cleaned up and dressed for the day, she hurried out the front door and immediately had to halt. Sitting at the foot of the front steps was Richter, his mouth stuffed with a dead marsh rabbit.
Richter, drop it.
Ginevra said, unable to look at his kill. Richter was completely still, staring at her with his amber eyes. She noticed his legs and belly were coated in swamp mud.
Shoot, I can't let you inside like this,
she groaned. He cocked his head, the rabbit twitching limply in his jaws. Ginevra sighed and shut the door behind her.
I'd wipe you down if I weren't running late,
she said, stepping past him.
You're just gonna have to stay outside until I get back.
She took off down the dirt road, the first traces of sunrise peering over the pines. Shuffling her papers in order, she glanced back at the house. He had turned to face her, but Richter was still sitting in the same spot, prey still in his jaws, his eyes gold pinpricks against the black shadow.
Weirdo,
she muttered, refocusing on the road. As Ginevra got her papers in order, she thought about the way he had looked at her with those honey-yellow eyes that somehow lacked its warm sweetness. She faltered a little. She thought Richter's eyes were more of a light brown. Maybe it was just the light, like how flowers or sundresses seem more vibrant in daylight, and she hadn't noticed until now. Or maybe she didn't know her precious dog as well as she thought. The schoolhouse was just around the corner. Ginevra pushed the morning aside and strode through the doors, ready to deliver the Monday morning math final. The day was long and stuffy, as expected, but other than little Jacob being absent, it went without a hitch. Jacob would have to report the next day with a signed excuse and retake the exam the following week, cutting into his summer vacation time. Ginevra smiled amusedly to herself as she left the schoolhouse and headed down the dirt road again. School in summertime was probably a fate worse than death for a fourth grader. But whatever amusement she felt died when she saw what was on the front steps to her home. Richter had apparently left a dead rabbit there. Its neck hung at an askew angle, and its blood-matted fur had attracted a veritable communion of blowflies.
Disgusting,
she grimaced, grabbing a broom from the patio and sweeping it off the path. It was heavier than she expected. It rolled off onto the grass, its head almost dragging alongside it, and the flies scattered in the glittering haze. Swatting at them with the broom, Ginevra hurried up the steps and slipped through the front door. Richter was inside the house, sitting at the end of the foyer, staring at her with those unseemly yellow eyes. They looked at each other, deathly silent. A single stray fly flew against the window pane, its buzz and aural aftertaste into nothingness. Wagging his tail, Richter trotted up to her, pressing his flank against her legs. Ginevra sighed with relief, bending down to pet him. The greeting was a welcome respite from the stress and unpleasantness of the earlier hours. As she looked around for his collar, she reflected on the fact that she explicitly left him outside that morning on account of his dirty paws. Perhaps I didn't close the back door properly, she thought, as she led him on his walk. As he strode ahead of her, she noticed his paws and the fur on his legs were immaculate, a better cleaning job than she could have done. Perhaps. Later that night, after a long evening of prepping for the social studies final, Ginevra collapsed atop her bed. She had barely closed her eyes when the mattress pitched and shook. Richter had jumped up in bed without permission.
Hey!
Ginevra snapped, groggy from incipient sleep.
Did I say you could come up?
She shoved at his body. He simply stared at her, unmoved. But it only took a moment for Ginevra's resolve to loosen.
Ah, heck,
she muttered, rolling back over.
You're all right, dog.
Richter stretched out and laid on his side, a paw pressed against Ginevra's back. She closed her eyes. His presence was comforting, familiar. It almost reminded her of Aaron, his warm form a rock for her to latch onto, that husky voice of his promising he'd love her for the rest of their lives. Life sure is inscrutable sometimes, she concluded, finally dozing off. Richter's paws slid further over her side. At the Tuesday social studies final, Miss Jenny realized she had 2 extra exams left over after passing them out. Jacob was still absent. Suddenly she realized that the front row seemed emptier than normal. Little Susan, soft-spoken yet smart as a whip, was missing as well.
Class, does anyone know where Susan is today?
They remained silent. Some allowed her a non-committal shrug.
Maybe she couldn't take the pressure?
Patrick offered.
Social studies was the only class she got B's in. That's enough.
Miss Jenny chided.
And how about Jacob? Anyone seen him since yesterday? Over the weekend?
More shrugs and stares. Miss Jenny sighed and wrung her hands nervously.
Okay. Well, let's get started then.
As the pencil scratched through the rest of the morning, the 2 empty seats seemed to emit a bad smell, drawing her attention, forcing her to look at them. The twin screw caps in the chair's headrest were like eyes, blank silver eyes judging her with venom from beyond the grave. Miss Jenny forced herself to look out the window. Something was wrong. She just couldn't piece together what. That evening, Richter refused his dry kibble, instead gazing at Ginevra with those amber eyes of his. No, they're definitely that color, she realized, now that they were inside with low lighting.
I could have sworn they were brown before. Well, what do you want then?
Ginevra said out loud.
I don't have anything else for you.
Richter bared his teeth and growled. Ginevra's heart sank as she backed up. He had never done that before, never given her a reason to think he'd act out. But before she could scold him, he pointed his muzzle at the refrigerator. Hesitantly, she opened it to reveal the Cornish hen still in its packaging. She looked at her dog to find him panting and wagging his tail, wearing that silly grin of his.
I guess so then. I was saving it for the weekend, but sure.
She took the bird out of the fridge and set it on the counter, but Richter surged forth and snatched it, bringing it crashing to the floor and ripping into it.
Richter!
She tried shouting, but her voice was lost among the dog's snarling and wet chewing mouth. Eventually, she threw her hands up and walked away.
Whatever. It's fine. Meat is meat. I'm sure you'll enjoy it more than me.
She sat at the table with a can of Spam. Richter jumped up across from her, laying half the mangled chicken across the tabletop. She couldn't help but smile.
Dig in, I guess,
she declared.
That's a good boy.
They both enjoyed their meals, happy and content with what they had. Richter jumped into bed with her again that night, and Ginevra didn't bother protesting. He nuzzled up close to her, his arm splaying over her shoulder again. She reached for it, for a moment sensing Aaron's muscular arm, but instead felt coarse fur and clawed pads. Still, she could feel the dog heaving behind her, deep, sleepy breaths sinking with hers. Relaxed, she finally closed her eyes and began to drift off.
Thank you for letting me in.
Ginevra's eyes shot open with a gasp, and she sprung up, looking around wildly for the intruder. But the bedroom was empty, and Richter had barely moved from his spot. A heart-drumming moment later, she had to conclude they were alone. But that failed to put her at ease. Instead, she looked down at the canine form in bed next to her. Richter was still motionless, but his eyes had locked onto hers again. A wave of delusion washed over Ginevra as she uttered her next words.
Was that you?
The dog continued staring. Ginevra scowled and shook her head. The stress and worry of the week was getting to her.
I love you, Ginevra.
Her hand drifted to her mouth. There was no other explanation. That voice, that hoarse, deep, sensual whisper, had come from... Slowly the dog rose to his haunches, sitting up in the bed, on eye level with Ginevra. His expression was flat, but those eyes burned with sickly golden fire.
My pearl, my sweet dove, my doting mistress.
The voice seemed to emanate from the depths of the dog's throat, sifting between the teeth in his unmoving jaws.
You let me in. You brought me to being. I am forever indebted to you.
Ginevra's voice was strangled and low.
How?
You asked for me, and I delivered myself unto you.
Richter licked his chops.
By your invocation of the powers that be, you granted me the gift of voice. Now I grant to you the gift of my unconditional committance.
I don't...
Ginevra scrambled out of the bed, trembling at the knees.
I don't understand. I did this. I allowed you to talk.
There is power in prayer,
Richter whispered, lowering his neck.
and love has a way of unlocking one's inhibitions.
My prayer did this?
Ginevra shook her head.
No, God would never. This is a dream. It has to be.
Richter emitted a low sigh.
Very well, as you wish.
The room went dark, and Ginevra keeled over, her skull thumping hard against the carpeted floor. When she awoke, she was lying in bed, the covers pulled up to her chin, unruffled and undisturbed, as if she had had the most peaceful sleep of her life.
What a strange dream.
She grunted, rolling over, nuzzling Aaron's arm around her. His fingertips curled, brushing the skin below her shoulder. Her hand drifted up to his, fingers interlocking and closing around each other, and she brought his hand up to her lips, kissing it softly. The arm around her was black-haired and muscular, but very much human. Her eyes sprung open. She shrieked and sprung out of bed again, throwing the cover off her, revealing nobody but Richter lying next to her. Just Richter, his canine features intact, who peered up at her with a blank expression. Goosebumps erupted on Ginevra's skin, the same spot where that nightmare hand had stroked. She wiped her mouth, trying to expel the taste on her lips, a taste that was earthen, yet somehow bodily and sweet. She fled to her bathroom, snapping the door shut and turning on the tub's faucet. The noisy fluid rush filled her head with mundane static, all but washing the fear away.
What are these visions?
She hissed, her voice lost amid the gushing water. For the first time that week, she was keen to get out of the house and hone her mind on the monotony of final exams. Her troubles only escalated at the schoolhouse. "Miss Sinclair," Principal Ketter said, standing in the doorway to her classroom. "A moment, please." He beckoned her to follow him to his office. "Miss Sinclair," he said once she sat across from him, "are you aware that 2 of your students have been missing the last 2 days?"
Yes, I've marked them down as absent, and they'll have to make up their exams next week,
she replied. No, I mean they're reported missing, Ketter said, narrowing his eyes. Susan Cole's parents said she left for school yesterday morning, and that was the last they'd seen of her. Same deal with Jacob Barnes.
I had no idea,
said Ginevra, her eyes wide.
What are we going to do?
For now, we're going to keep quiet, said Ketter, leaning back in his chair. The authorities are doing all they can, and the rest of the school still has work to do. Best not to burden your pupils with bad news in the middle of this week.
I understand,
she answered, standing up.
I hope they find those kids safe and sound. I'll pray for them. Please, keep me updated.
Will do. Ginevra strode down the empty, reverberating hallway and entered her classroom briskly.
Sorry I'm late, class,
she announced, readying the science finals on her desk.
I'll give you all extra time to make up for it.
The class was quiet as they stared back at her. Miss Jenny made a small noise through her nose.
No comment from you, Patrick?
She looked up and her heart sank. There were 3 empty chairs in the room now. Every bone and joint ached in Ginevra's body as she finally made it back to her place that afternoon. Predictably, Richter was waiting for her in the foyer.
Welcome home,
the ethereal voice said. Ginevra halted. Something sharp and acidic boiled in her chest.
So it wasn't a dream.
Passion knows no time of day, my love. But I ought to have told you at a more wakeful hour.
The dog's ears perked.
Now there is no more doubt in your heart, is there?
She shook her head.
No, there isn't.
Richter walked up to her and pressed his flank against her legs.
Good. Now, I yearn for your touch.
As if in a trance, Ginevra leaned forward and scratched the base of his tail.
Come, let us break bread.
A half hour later, a pork dinner for 2 sat steaming at the dinner table. Richter, sitting across from her, devoured the meat in 2 bites, again leaving the vegetables untouched. Ginevra couldn't help but smile as she took a small bite herself. For a moment it was Richter's birthday again, and he was the same goofy, lovable dog she had known for those 4 years.
I don't understand,
Ginevra finally said, breaking the silence.
My prayer made you able to talk? The one I said that night?
Oh, the credit is yours,
said Richter.
But
she toiled over her next words.
I always learned that prayer was meant to show gratitude and to give yourself strength. It was never to make things happen. I love you, Richter, as my best friend. But I didn't ask for this.
There is power you are unaware of,
said the dog, cocking his head.
Power and grace given to the most worthy of mankind. I am your miracle, your divine apparition.
The most worthy of mankind,
Ginevra repeated.
Me?
Richter gave a nod.
God rewards, and I am your reward.
Something warm, inexplicable, scent-stealing rose up in Ginevra's stomach. It was unbridled, fluttering ecstasy, elation of the heart and soul.
I've been through a lot in my life,
she replied in a small voice.
Heartbreak, misery. But you've always been there. You are my blessing, Richter. I love you.
Richter's tail thumped like a drumbeat against the back of his chair. Ginevra stood up, overcome with mirth.
There's still some leftover cake in the fridge, if you're craving sweets.
He barked. the chair practically shaken from his manic wagon. That night, the two cuddled in bed again. Ginevra had finally relented and turned to face Richter for the first time.
It always seemed like science was hit and miss for my students,
she was saying.
Once you get into cellular biology and all that jazz, all those organelles, chromosomes, I think it's just too much for kids that age. When I graded their papers today, it was the widest grade distribution so far. I wonder how Susan would have done.
Darkness settled inside her, and some of that infectious passion ebbed away.
Poor Susan Cole. I hope she's okay wherever she is. Jacob and Patrick, too. They're just kids, for God's sake. If they're lost and alone somewhere, they won't last long. But I hate to think that someone took them, or someone did something with them. Oh, God.
Her throat constricted with impending tears. She took several shuddering breaths.
I do love those children, as if they were my own.
The dog licked her face.
Cast your woes aside, woman. You take on enough troubles already.
She sighed.
I suppose so.
She scratched behind the dog's ears. He continued licking her cheeks, her throat. She closed her eyes, letting that electricity jolt through her. Hands gently squeezed her shoulders. She dared not open her eyes again, out of fear that what she might see would sully the illusion, would shatter the welling feelings inside her.
No,
she said in a muffled tone.
This is wrong.
Despite seeing nothing but darkness, she imagined the tiny figure nailed to the cross on the opposite wall watching her with God's eyes.
He's watching us. I can't.
You and I are alone.
There was a bizarre scratching, rattling sound.
You and I on top of the world.
The solid-sounding thunk of an object falling to the floor. Ginevra suddenly felt shameless, uninhibited. Those holy eyes were now blind. She relaxed. The hands gripped tighter, strong, dexterous, very much human. The form next to her shifted, and she could sense it over her now, casting a psychic shadow across her body. And still that tongue licked, impossibly long, muscular, boiling like the tip of a molten spear. It drifted, exploring places unattended, amid years of loveless void. Ginevra was late the next morning. She burst through the schoolhouse's front doors, face greasy with sweat, dress rumpled and wrinkled. Her death grip on the stacks of English finals had left impressions in the papers. She almost ran into Principal Ketter, who again was stationed in the doorway to her room. "Office, now!" His expression was even more grave than the day before. Her inside seemed to freeze up as she reluctantly followed him back to his office. He closed the door, but didn't bother sitting down. "Patrick Hudson has been reported missing too," he said, not looking at her. "But there's a development with him. His parents say one moment he was walking down the road, they looked away, and then he was just gone. He had just passed by a house." He finally met her face. "Your house."
What are you implying?
"I'm not implying anything," he replied, holding his hands up. "But don't be surprised if they start viewing you as a suspect."
They talked to you, didn't they?
said Ginevra, her eyes narrowing. "I told them I couldn't imagine you doing anything so horrible," he clarified. "Much less anything at all. I don't have any reason to think you had something to do with this, but it's in their hands now."
I didn't do anything,
she asserted, her throat locking up again. "I know you didn't, but this has to play out. Justice must be dispensed for the sake of those little ones." Shaking her head, she excused herself from Ketter's office and hurried over to her room.
Sorry again, class.
she said breathlessly, nearly collapsing into her desk.
Miss Jenny,
Katie said, raising her hand.
where's Susan and Jacob? And Patrick?
Another asked.
They're just absent.
Said Miss Jenny, the back of her neck prickling.
I'm sure you'll see them again by next week. Let's stay focused on today's exam right now.
But as the morning progressed, Miss Jenny could tell schoolwork was the last thing on their minds. Eyes kept flitting towards the empty desks, and she had to tell off the class a handful of times. She could only be thankful they hadn't yet noticed the fourth vacancy, the desk that had once belonged to little Jessica. Even as they left for the day, turning in their papers for her to grade, she could not concentrate. Not only was the grade distribution chaotic for this exam too, but her mind swam with the memories of the night before. The lascivious acts she had partaken in, unholy bonds that would have made God himself blush, even if those bonds had been with an actual man. Her sins were so massive, so encroaching and strangling, she couldn't possibly articulate them. Perhaps it was for the better keeping them bottled up inside. The shame of admitting to such horridness might have killed her on the spot. It was early evening when Ginevra finally left the schoolhouse, yet she had only graded 3/4 of the exams. The sunset glared upon her as she shambled down the dirt road back home. Richter was sitting patiently in the foyer, watching her with pleasant bemusement. She felt boxed in. Behind her, the looming obscure tragedy that threatened to sweep her up in its incriminating tide. Before her, the source of her unchristly transgressions. Neither direction seemed particularly commendable, but despair tugged at her soul. She slammed the door shut.
Just take me, Richter.
Ginevra glimpsed the dog standing on his hind legs and thrusting his paws for her shoulders, but she closed her eyes, and hairy human-like arms encompassed her, and the body that pressed against hers bore the musculature of a man. Yet the slithering organ that stroked and constricted her was still an inhumanly long tongue. And right there in the foyer, he took her. When Ginevra came around, everything was dark. The grandfather clock in the neighboring living room read well past midnight. She slowly rose to a stand, still weak at the knees. Despite the gloom, she could make out a dark red stain pulled underneath her. It formed a trail through the house, heading for the back door. She followed it. The droplets led outside. The full moon made it easy to determine them from the ghostly pale grass. The trail stopped at the metal shed covering the entrance to the root cellar. Ginevra paused. She hadn't been down there since Aaron was around. He had gone through a gardening kick, and he had yielded a meager crop of onions and potatoes, which he had stored in the cellar, promising her one day when he had enough to make a delicious root vegetable medley for her. She never got to have that dish. Still, the blood called to her, and she resumed following. She wrenched open the trap door and climbed down the ladder, 6 feet underground. Everything smelled of dirt and decaying plant matter. Her feet touched the ground. She turned around and absorbed the sight before her. Years of neglect had allowed tree roots to snake through the earthen walls, crisscrossing and tangling through the wooden support beams like the veins of some subterranean giant. But the path ahead was clear, illuminated by hellish red light. And at its end was the brunt of the procession. She recognized Patrick and Jacob at her right, their dead bodies stuck in standing positions through pikes, garbed in loose-fitting suits. At her left was Susan and Jessica, mounted in the same fashion, stuffed into flowing white dresses. Presiding over them was the corpse of Principal Ketter, hung from the ceiling by a tree root noose, clad in a black cassock. The blood trail stopped with him. The groom, was sitting on his haunches, regarding Ginevra with his glowing yellow eyes.
"Here comes the bride,"
he sang.
"Here comes the bride."
Tears finally broke as Ginevra proceeded down the aisle. She approached the children and saw they had all died the same way. The flesh around their necks was shredded, as if torn up by a dog. Jessica, the flower girl, held a cluster of nightshade in her lifeless grasp. Jacob delicately clutched an obsidian ring in his. Susan and Patrick, the maid of honor and best man, wore contorted grins on their faces. Ginevra wondered if they had died smiling.
"My bride-to-be,"
Richter cooed as Ginevra drew level with them.
"I knew you would find your way here.
He addressed the dead people.
Dearly deceased, we are gathered here tonight to join these two sinners in unholy matrimony."
"I never wanted this,"
Ginevra whispered.
"Not at all."
"By the time you summoned me, it was too late,"
Richter admonished.
"I found the perfect vessel. You gave yourself to me days ago. Your story ended before you even knew it began."
"Perfect vessel,"
Ginevra echoed.
"You mean..."
"Your beloved Richter has not been with us for some time,"
the thing mocked.
"Ever since that night you uttered your idolatrous creed, you tilled a ground most fertile. You let me in."
Ginevra's vision spun. She struggled to stay upright. Her voice was small and diminished.
"Lucifer."
"One name among many,"
he confirmed.
"But one of my more favored, the Lightbringer. I brought light to your life. I set you ablaze."
The dog stood on its hind legs again, and this time Ginevra forced herself to watch. Its front legs thickened. Its paws became worm-like fingers. Its chest and shoulders crunched with fresh, burgeoning muscle. Its muzzle flattened. It became a man's face, tainted with animal features, but handsome and full nonetheless.
"You and I will properly consummate and christen these lands with blood. This I vow."
Principal Ketter's suspended corpse gave a twitch. His lips parted, and a handful of wiggling mealworms dropped from his mouth onto the ground. The voice that emanated from him was grungy and low.
"Do you take this woman to be your underworldly wedded wife?" "I do,"
Lucifer promised, brushing Ginevra's cheek.
"Do you take this man to be your underworldly wedded husband?"
Ginevra shuddered at Lucifer's touch. Her eyes flitted around. The corpses had all moved to look at her. Each one bore a smile. Her pulse jumped in her neck. The whole week had been one maddening descent, culminating in the precipice of Hell's Maw. Carnal longing stirred inside her, shameful yet insistent. Why should she refuse?
I do not.
She stated. No. The entity before her almost sounded amused. You would turn down the world. You would turn down all the delicious satisfaction damnation has to offer for the sake of your irredeemably condemned mortal soul.
I would,
said Ginevra, looking away.
If I'm to do one last good thing on this earth, it'll be telling you no. That's all I have left. All I can do.
Lucifer cocked his head.
You know you loved it when I fucked you like that.
Ginevra's fist clenched.
No more.
She dipped her head.
No more.
Lucifer spread his hands apart and backed away.
Very well. I am bound to your word.
In a puff of black smoke, he vanished. Those golden eyes lingered for a split second longer. And suddenly, Principal Ketter's corpse exploded. It showered the root cellar with blood, caking the dead corpses in Ginevra's living body in salty, acrid red. The sour iron taste stung in her nose and mouth, and she screamed, rushing for the ladder, stumbling and bouncing off the walls, finally wrapping her hands around the rungs. Her palms and feet were slippery with blood, but she pulled herself up, gasping and crying and choking. The trapdoor flew open before she could touch it. Flashlight beams pierced her eyes and she screamed again, shielding her face.
Here!
A voice shouted.
She's covered in it!
Iron-like hands reached down and hauled Ginevra out of the cellar, and immediately forced her face down into the grass.
Ginevra Sinclair, you're under arrest for the murders of Jacob Barnes, Susan Cole.
It wasn't me!
She shrieked as her wrists were bound behind her.
It was the dog! Richter! The dog did it!
Patrick Hudson, Jessica Tremblay.
He's the devil! Please! He's the devil in disguise!
And Dean Ketter. Are you of sound mind to understand these charges?
You have to listen to me. He's down there now. Go and see. Go and see.
Part 1. London, 1982. Like a dog come running at his master's whistle, I RSVP'd yes to an invitation to Vernon Copeland's Halloween party to view his latest acquisition, a lost piece of cinema from the early 20s, a screen test hitherto undiscovered, etc., etc. Copeland was a cinephile and an antiquarian, as he was also other things of far less reputable standing. His home, a handsome stucco-fronted townhouse, spread over 5 floors in the plutocratic bowels of Knightsbridge, was stuffed to the rafters with artifacts of historical significance. For the past decade or so, I'd occupied the post of 2-bit private dick in Copeland's court of boorish profiteers. In reality, this meant I cashed my not inconsiderable checks as a kind of apt proprietor come arm-breaker. Professors, antiquaries, rabbis, philatelists, and several prominent members of Parliament were among those notables who had availed themselves of my services. Missions usually consisted of wresting relics, curios, and other articles of virtue from individuals or institutions of a special stubbornness, usually by means of violence, blackmail, or intimidation on my part. I'd long lost track of the priceless treasures and objets d'art I consigned to the sweet oblivion of Copeland's private collection. It was about 9 o'clock when I showed up at Knightsbridge. I was wearing my brown double-breasted suit with white shirt, burgundy tie, matching waistcoat, and my best pair of Oxford brogues. I was tired and needed a shave, and the ache in my lumbar had sharpened like it always did when the weather turned cold. Inside, in the huge barren lobby from which a wrought iron staircase ascended into the shadows of an upper floor, I shrugged off my coat and handed it to a tight-lipped waiter. I didn't let him take my hat, though. I waited and listened to the muted sound of voices and laughter drifting from somewhere deeper within the house. When the waiter returned, he nodded and took me with him along a panelled hall that ended in a pair of big double doors. He ushered me into a large drawing room, dimly lit by a rustic stone fireplace, in which chestnut logs with the bark still on them smouldered lazily. Autumn rain tapped the leaded bay windows. The air was drugged with the mingled smells of cigar smoke and sandalwood. I scooped several glasses from a circulating tray of dirty martinis and hors d'oeuvres and banished myself to one of a trio of red leather sofas by the fireplace, where a pair of cozy sodium lamps had been switched on for ambiance. The bottle of bourbon I'd killed earlier in the evening was hitting me hard now, but at least it made the scoffing mob of socialites and dilettantes a touch more palatable. As usual, none of those snooty assholes so much as acknowledged my presence. Our spheres were as immiscible as oil and water. They guzzled their drinks empty and rattled the ice cubes at the waiters, watching each other along their eyes, ready to be smarmy or odious as the situation required. I stared at the opposite wall, at the most antique of 3 previously unknown Francesco de Goya paintings that I'd appropriated from the private collection of a reclusive connoisseur in Zagreb. Or had it been Tirana? I was just about buzzed enough to begin doubting my own recollections. The guy who owned the paintings was a real weirdo, though. I remembered that much. Creepy bastard had a subterranean gallery beneath his rambling hillside mansion. A narrow, low-ceilinged room filled with the most grotesque artworks you could possibly imagine. I tossed down the dregs of another martini and flagged down a morose waiter in a white tuxedo jacket who was carrying a fresh tray. The painting drank the red and amber glow of the sodium lamps. It was a dramatic landscape from a dark and ominous palette. A mountain of black clouds loomed over the blasted wasteland of an ancient stone city, a sea of flaming ruins, portal to Gehenna, pandemonium, the vestibule of hell itself. The more I stared, the more the clouds took on the aspect of an unimaginably monstrous creature, a knotted mass of scaled reptilian splendor. I'd killed a couple more martinis and was still staring at the painting, at the yellowish moon, which had now taken on the aspect of a fanged and sphincter-like maw, when I spotted Copeland wading towards me, carrying a bottle of booze by the neck and chewing on a pipe stem. The antiquary was cataclysmically drunk. He slouched on the sofa beside me and laid the bottle in my lap. "You look shitty, Noah. Like you've caught the wrong end of a stick 6 times over." "Yeah, well, that'd still be half as many times as you." He guffawed and told me to have a drink. "That's a 13-year-old Scotch," he said, as he ogled in passing the décolletage of a beautiful creature who might have been half mortal, half Hellenic goddess. I chugged from the bottle of Scotch. Hot on the heels of said beauty was Tertius Brooke, a once critically acclaimed Kentish poet, whose bland pastorals now seemed bound for obscurity. Funny how things go, eh? He wrinkled his nose at the sight of me, and that was okay. I was more of a Yeats man myself. Copeland departed with promises of an imminent return, pushing his way through the milling crowd. I traced a handful of painkillers with another body blow from the scotch and glared at the waiter as he gathered up my small collection of empty martini glasses. I sat for a minute, or 2, or 10, observing with mild disgust the throng of fustian literati. Despite the pills, my body still ached. After half a dozen bullets and a respectable number of brawls and scrapes, not to mention a seaplane crash off the southern coast of Japan, I broke almost everything that a body could break. I suspected it always would. Body casts and neck braces were like socks and shoes to me. Pain a stalwart companion, a constant reminder that flesh was a perishable currency, forever indebted to death. I sat with the bottle clasped loosely in my lap. After a while, I began to notice a subtle difference in the atmosphere of the room, an undercurrent of anticipation that hummed like a high-voltage wire. I sat up straighter. A slew of decorous waiters floated from the darkness like moths, flitting amongst the guests and politely ushering them to plush Chesterfields and comfortable old wingbacks. Through a shifting haze of cigar and cigarette smoke, I saw the waiter who had collected my empty glasses emerge from behind a curtain on the opposite side of the room, pushing a trolley loaded with a box of film canisters and an ancient Bell & Howell screen projector. The room was already dim as the bottom of an aquarium when a bowing waiter with blonde white hair decided to kill the sodium lamps. Immediately, shadows that crouched in the corners thickened and crept forth. Copeland reappeared and settled in beside me. His features were hellish in the flickering orange firelight. When he leaned over to pat my forearm, red patches burned startlingly in his cheeks, and his eyes were just glints of fire in the shadowy mask of his face. "Behold, Dracula's doom," he whispered theatrically. He took a deep drag on his pipe, puffed a leisurely swirl of smoke at the ceiling, then added, in a more reasonable tone, or at least a 7-minute test reel of sand. The room became a cave suffused with silvery light. The camera aperture splashed against a palace section of wall where a bookcase had stood until recently. On the title card, attributed to Victor Lipovsky, entitled Dracula's Doom. Below this, a short string of characters that might have been Arabic or Cyrillic. The film had been shot on muddy 35mm, and its condition was much deteriorated. The frames flickered, arrived in jittering streams. Frequent cigarette burns ate inwards from the corners of the screen. Reality dilated and contracted faster and faster, until, in a sudden moment of dislocation, I was sucked into the aperture's shuttering iris, into a grey, craggy, mist-choked landscape that possessed all the sinister gravitas of a classic Hammer horror film, where the first scene unfolded. The fog churned and roiled as it wound through the twisted, unpaved streets of a village, past small thatched-roofed peasant cottages, with their windows shuttered and barred. A ruined castle loomed on the horizon. The building jutted from a steep, forested hillside. The camera swooped over its clustered maze of turrets and towers, where bodies had been impaled upon spires and weather vanes, then panned slowly across a massive lancet window, showing a stained glass knight, locked in everlasting battle against the most fearsome archetype of all demon dragons, whose awful eyes harbored eons of blackest night. The knight had snapped off his sword not far from the hilt, and did not appear to be doing too well. A bat fluttered past, then another, just in case we still hadn't gotten the hint. A screen crumpled into darkness, and then the darkness reversed to reveal a cavernous hall that rose to a peak buttressed by heavy wooden beams, which looked as though they'd been stolen from an old church. Torches flickered in soot-streaked sconces. Heavy drapes lay tumbled in dramatic folds several yards from the tall windows. Again, stained glass all over the place. Moonlight illuminated a pallid figure, scraping away at the strings of a rickety violin. The figure swayed from side to side, erupting in short, spontaneous bursts of movement, the way a spider might. My innards lurched. I squirmed in my seat and downed a huge gulp of scotch. The violinist's expression distorted in the rapturous manner of a satiated addict. His black eyeball rolled at the camera, the pupil devouring the whites of the eye and filling the screen, filling my skull with night eternal. The room shrank. A whispering crowd became dry leaves rustled by a stiff autumn wind. From the black and infinite void, the chords of a violin skirled an evil symphony, scratching my ears, my brain. Something rose swiftly from the gloom, something like mist, taking on the shape of a man. I could discern nothing of this figure save for the hideous luminescence of its corpse-like complexion, a deathly pale face, touched with a blood-on-snow vibrancy. The violin shrieked a dirge, a nails-on-slate, glacially shifting sound that rocked me like a middleweight's left hook. The darkness bled in malted vermilion. Hoarse, stricken screams shrilled and died as exhausted sobs. Shrilled, then died. Shrilled, died. The thin white figure was laughing in the dark, the most sinister laughter I've ever heard. The many-voiced cackle of a raven non-compos mentis. Darkness receded, slinked back into the corners of the screen. The dull points of the violinist's fangs glinted as he seized the corners of his mouth, then pulled. A cigarette burn bloomed and ate outwards to the corners of my vision as the film spun off the reel. My sense of utter dislocation faded as the regular space-time continuum reasserted itself, reconstituting at the atomic level. Somebody vomited. Somebody else said, "Jesus Christ!" A deathly silence followed. Then the muttered exclamations of the crowd began to run around the room like rats. The bottle of scotch was empty as a waterhole in a drought. I flagged a waiter for a drink. He nodded shakily and returned with a whiskey neat. I snatched it from him and downed it in a single gulp. My hand trembled. Ice rattled in the empty glass. What the hell was... Jesus, what did you say it was called? I did my best to subdue my rattling nerves, throttling back to a more visceral reaction to emote at least a thin veneer of calm. Copeland stared vaguely past me for a second, rubbing a thumb on his jaw. One of his hands clutched his pipe. Slowly, carefully, he packed it with tobacco, held a match to it, and puffed a cloud of smoke. "Dracula's doom," he said around the pipe stem. His dark, leathery eyes got hard and steady as charts chipped off Botswana and agate. A lost Russian flick from the era of silent cinema. I rubbed my cheek, the thick, coarse stubble going to beard. The violinist's sinister tune weeded its way into my thoughts, a deep itch, and the pyramidal cells of my hippocampus, a fusillade of neuronal firing. I had another drink in my hand now. My head swam, slow and peaceful as koi fish in a temple pond. What happened to the rest of it? I asked finally. Copeland puffed smoke and said, "Presumed destroyed, until most recently. But I believe..." Then the rest of the guests came in for the kill, the whole lot of them swarming around Copeland like a shoal of piranhas. I found myself pinned down by the verbal crossfire of a tall, hatchet-faced man in a smart tweed hacking jacket, and would have made Sean Connery jealous, and Tertius Brooke himself, who was in fine form after an evening of getting shit-faced. I rose as steadily as my punch-drunk body permitted, and split the well-heeled crowd like a banana peel. I melted into the background and spent the next 2 hours courting sweet, ephemeral oblivion by way of a bottle of Suntory single malt I'd found in the scullery. I got my coat and went out through the back and sat down at the top of the narrow, dark stairs to the servants' entrance. I took a long pull from the bottle and looked up at the night sky, at the stars strewn in the shining continuum from one end of the heavens to the other, sparkling like flashes of light on the facets of a million celestial diamonds. The garden was gloomy. All I could make out were a pair of wrought-iron Victorian-style lanterns glowing on either side of an oak pergola covered with wisteria. The neighboring houses brooded like tombs. I couldn't stop thinking about Dracula's doom, nor could I shake the sound of that horrid string music. Faint strains of it rising like mist from some black well of my brain. Then, it suddenly occurred to me on a dim level what Copeland had said after the picture had ended. What the lizard in the back of my mind had been screaming all along. The unsettling realization chilled me, chased prickles across my body, and left my guts in the back of my throat. What lingered in my stomach was a sensation you get when you reach the top of a flight of stairs, and instead of the top step, there's only empty space. I sat there in the womb-like dark of that cold October night and listened to the muffled hubbub of voices and laughter drifting out through the half-open kitchen door, and thought about that. About how there couldn't have been any music, or in fact any sound at all, because Dracula's doom was a silent film. Part 2. Still London, still the 80s. I met Copeland for an all-expenses lunch in March of '83, and he laid it all out on the table. A swanky French restaurant just off Park Lane, Le Lièvre d'Or, was the old man's preferred lunchtime haunt. Today he'd snagged a booth with an admirable view of short skirts and hosiery, a cavalcade of nubile young interns and paralegals perched on the mahogany stools that flanked the far end of the bar. The slick-haired bartender brought Copeland a bottle of red wine labelled Chateau Clos du Notaire, and for me, a Crown Royal neat, with the whiskey quivering at the rim of the glass. Lunch itself consisted of Scottish langoustines and a buttery samphire condiment, a platter of snails with garlic and parsley, a selection of classic French farmhouse cheeses, and a roasted saddle of venison, hailing from a country estate in Wales. I ate and glanced casually at the end of the bar. The food was all right. Whiskey tasted clean and fiery. Copeland sucked snails from their ram's horn shells and set the empty carapaces carefully on the silver plate while he endeavoured to explain the importance of some out-with-the-arc camera he'd recently acquired at auction. After a few minutes of this, he fished a leather cigar case out of an inner pocket, lighted one of his monogrammed cigars, and set it in the ashtray to smolder. He moved his chin at the case. "Please." I shook my head. "Thanks. I've quit." He nodded, shrugged. Then he put the cigar in his mouth and leaned back in his chair with his hands clasped together behind his head. He blew smoke straight upwards and watched it spiral towards the distant ceiling. Dracula's Doom was one of the earliest attempts to bring Stoker's infamous Count to the silver screen. It even predates F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu by a year or two. Tell me, sir, are you familiar with the filmography of Victor Lipovsky? Again, I shook my head. A Russian fellow whose name is at times distorted. Some accounts refer to him as Lavotsky, others Lavatsky. He cranked out a dozen or so obscure silent films back in the 10s and 20s. Most of his work is now considered lost. Copeland set the smoking cigar down in the ashtray and reached for another snail. It's thought that Dracula's Doom was made in Kiev sometime between 1917 and 1919, smack bang in the middle of the Russian Civil War. Not much freedom back then either. Soviet filmmaking was very much a state-controlled affair. Rumor says Lipovsky shot his thoroughly unsanctioned vampire flick surreptitiously over a period of just 13 days. It goes that many of the actors were shell-shocked infantrymen who would later be exiled to remote Siberian penal colonies or confined to psychiatric institutions. Despite being hailed as something of a masterpiece, the film was never widely shown, and the reels likely destroyed during the Bolshevik occupation of the city. I got a slice of venison and forked it into my mouth. Pain nibbled at my neck like a prurient lover. I chewed slowly, resisting the urge to swallow a handful of party-colored pills in my coat pocket. Oh, so like Dracula and the Gulag, eh? Sounds interesting. Something like that. Copeland grinned tightly. Naturally, I own an entire vault of vanished motion picture prints and masters I'm sure many collectors would sacrifice a firstborn to examine. Over the years, I've managed to obtain copies of Lipovsky's other works, but Dracula's Doom has remained elusive. Until now. Until the early 1950s, when what purported itself to be an authentic test print surfaced in Bucharest as part of an estate sale for the late Lascar Vacarescu, a hermit cinesta whose particular interest lay in morbid and silent features. London After Midnight, The Golem and the Dancing Girl, The Monster of Frankenstein. The list goes on. Suffice to say, his collection was vast and incredibly valuable. Define incredibly valuable for me. Copeland produced a fancy gold-nibbed pen and wrote a set of numbers on a nearby napkin. A substantial figure, to be sure. Vacarescu died in 1953. Nasty vehicle rollover in the Carpathian Mountains. No identifiable remains. An estranged son of Asian heritage debuted at the funeral as the heir apparent, and stuck around just long enough to auction off dear old Dad's beloved collection. The test reels of Dracula's Doom were among a sizable portion of the Vacarescu estate snapped up by an exceedingly wealthy Hungarian baroness. Then, subsequently looted during the uprising of '56. They reappeared over a decade later in 1967 at an exhibition hosted by the National Museum of Film in Bucharest, alongside what was alleged to be an undiscovered print of the full film. Copeland put his cigar back in his mouth. A bouquet of sunlight slanted across his face from the left, calling out the network of deep furrows texturing his cheeks and forehead, and showing me clearly how drink had made a soft ruin of his heavy but once quite handsome features. At the bar, an elegant redhead with 8 carats of diamond on her finger went off into a peal of laughter. Muted strains of chamber music drifted in from somewhere. Abruptly, a line from Yeats floated through my head. Of what is past, or passing, or to come. I shivered as though somebody had just walked over my grave. Alas, much of the exhibition was turned to charcoal briquettes by a fire in 72, Copeland continued. Which brings me to the chap who auctioned off the screen test. A Slav by the name of Demes Sekelsky, certifiable lunatic who claims his great-grandfather was a psychiatric nurse who played Dr. Seward in the original film. I slugged the last of my whiskey and flagged an urbane waiter with glistening hair to set me up with another. What makes you think this Sekelsky guy's crazy? I asked, rubbing my aching neck. I studied Copeland through his haze of cigar smoke. And how'd he get hold of the film, anyway? Sekelsky is quite the man of mystery. You see, he made a series of claims that his forebear hadn't simply starred in Dracula's Doom, but that he'd actually helped Lipovsky write the script and sell it to his patron. There is a character in Dracula's Doom, a schizophrenic violinist who believes himself to be the Count. Allegedly, Lipovsky based his Dracula character on a real-life individual detailed in Sekelsky's great-grandfather's journals. He claimed that outside of music, the fellow's interest lay in blood rights and eternal life, which all sounds far-fetched, but possible enough. Wouldn't you agree? Only with Lipovsky dead since 1946 and the cast and crew of Dracula's Doom seemingly vanished into the ether, Sekelsky's claims fell on deaf ears. That fire at the National Museum of Film? Well, who do you think was on the books as a consultant before he stabbed the director half to death and tried to torch the place? I'll give you 3 guesses, and you won't need the first 2. I chewed this over, then nodded for Copeland to continue. Sekelsky absconded with several artifacts of incalculable value that remain as yet unaccounted for. It is presumed Dracula's Doom is among them. According to his cellmate, Sekelsky scarcely stopped babbling about it. The blood-hungry abyss, an open wound in the universe itself, etc., etc. Waiter returned with my drink and went away. I took a good gulp of it and said, "Cellmate?" Sekelsky just concluded a hard stretch in Gela prison, Romania. Got caught at the Serbian border and nailed for arson, robbery, and murder. Copeland poured the dregs of his 3rd glass of wine down his throat and refilled the glass to the brim. He lifted another snail from the platter and sucked it from its shell with a short slurp. And by concluded, I mean to say he tore out the guard's throat with his teeth and absconded into the wilds of the continent. The old man chewed the snail in a manner that called to mind another, more familiar de Goya painting. A crazed, disheveled, and monstrous Saturn, chewing the arm off one of his sons. I regarded him silently for a moment, deciding whether or not to mention I'd have called them night terrors, but that weren't exactly the right term for the bizarre hallucinations I experienced most evenings. Truth be told, I hadn't counted more than 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night since the party and the screening of Dracula's Doom. But it was more than just nightmares, wasn't it? I could almost chalk those up to an amalgam of trauma, sleep deprivation, and a dray horse's dose of drugs and booze. What about the noises? The amateur violinist who had apparently taken up residence in a nearby flat, where he or she practiced well into the wee hours of the morning. All this despite none of my neighbors having heard anything of the sort. Then there was the cold, mirthless laughter that floated up to my window from the courtyard. The laughter of a castrato, or a child, or of someone pretending to be one. There were other sounds too. Giggling. Slithering. Once, behind the closed bathroom door, I swore I'd heard someone whispering a prayer in a foreign tongue. I had been turning my thick, squat whiskey glass around on the dark wooden tabletop. I swallowed the rest of the drink and said, "So, it's not Job Sikowski is holed up somewhere in deepest, darkest Europe with a lost Russian vampire flick, of incalculable value. And as per custom, here I am, the good old Private Dick, who's played the part of a hired gun so many times before. Jesus, the rest writes itself." Copeland sipped his wine and nodded. "You know what I want, Noah, and you know how deep my pockets run. As always, you will be generously rewarded." I knew all right, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, if I got my hands on the old man's film, I might just be able to sleep without nightmares again. Part 3. Deepest, Darkest Europe. "May I get you anything else, sir?" I started and nearly upset my plastic cup of softened ice cubes and flaccid lemon rinds. The cabin windows were roseate, the sky ablaze with orange and purple light, burning through layered fields of cirrocumulus clouds. The flight attendant leaned across the sleeping woman on my left to take my empty cup. She was petite and wore a navy two-piece uniform with a dark red scarf around her neck. Her lips and nails were a similar shade of red, her young features pancaked under a layer of makeup so thick it might have been poured from a can of varnish. "Another one of these, love, please," I said in a slurred voice. Why am I slurring? "Sir?" The attendant graced me with a strained smile. "Sorry." I felt very drunk and disoriented, thought I might throw up. I took a deep breath to gather a measure of coherency and said, "Can I have another vodka, please?" To allay any possible concerns, I waited until the attendant had pushed a service trolley further down the aisle before I slammed the last inch of tepid vodka. Hair of the dog that bit me. My gourd rose as the plane yawed violently to port, and then leveled out and plowed ahead. I slumped against the window, tingling all over and sweating like I was in a sauna. Motion sickness had really worked me over, more so than the effects of the drink. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, the windows were dusky red, going dark. My neighbor snored gently beside me. The plane shuddered sideways in heavy turbulence, and that did it for me. I unbuckled and lurched from my seat, squeezing none too gently past my seatmate, whose snoring continued without so much as a hitch. The nearest facilities were occupied, and a young couple of women were waiting their turn. I pushed past them and made my way along the aisle to the rear of the plane where, thankfully, the sole lavatory was vacant. I slipped inside and shot the bolt home and dropped to my knees over the toilet, dry heaving and hugging the edge of the bowl like a childhood pet. The plane shook. My head knocked hard against the plastic wall. I vomited a gush of acrid bile, spilling through a sluice. I clung to the bowl and made animal pleas for mercy. I tried to gather my thoughts, but it was as if my brain had turned to glass, and the booze was a sledgehammer. I could feel the shattered pieces rattling in my skull, each reflecting the reflection of another in a dizzying kaleidoscope of images. "Oh God," I said, and vomited again. Eventually, sweaty and shivering and weak as a kitten, I pushed myself to my feet and laved cold water all over my face at the low plastic basin of the sink. I was in the act of pulling a paper towel from the metal dispenser when the fluorescent strip above the mirror began to flicker rapidly. Then it dimmed, and the toilet became red as a dark room. Between the lights, furious staccato flashes, and for an interval of time that lasted far too long, the mirror was full of something dreadful. A surrealist impression of someone so tall they'd been forced to double over just to squeeze into the cramped toilet. Their face was ivory pale, a bloodless wound. A wound in reality itself. Then, an evil chuckle. A sound like dry ice splitting. Someone cursed and hammered on the door. The deep red shadows drained away, and the strip light hummed and blinked coldly overhead. I shut my eyes tight and opened them, and wiped the sweat off my face with the back of my hand, still a little dizzy. The acrid taste of vomit lingered. I hawked, spat into the sink, and rinsed my mouth with chlorine-flavored tap water. When I opened the door, there was a big reddish man with a prize-fighter's nose and a garden of broken veins in his florid cheeks standing outside. "What's the matter, guy?" he drawled. "You full of bricks or something?" He had 30 or 40 pounds on me, but I didn't care. I was running on a terrific vodka buzz and, more importantly, the adrenal response of whatever the hell I'd just seen in the toilet. My bones ached, and I was more than a little green around the gills. Didn't matter though. I could still put my fist through this bozo's face. Except I couldn't, because in the B-side of the current universe, I'd leave half his teeth on the floor only to find the Romanian police waiting for me upon arrival. So, instead, I sucked it up and returned to my seat, where my snoring sleepmate still slept with her chin on her chest. Once the plane had landed, I rented one of the new Mercedes-Benz 380 SLs in compellingly nondescript shade of grey and drove to the address of Copeland's contact through a countryside that might have been a scene from a Cezanne painting come to life. Lush, arsenical green fields paced the road for improbable distances and were beset by tractors and hay balers, barns, houses, and the occasional church slid past, all set back from the road in neat, tactile postures and all painted the same hard, clean, uniform white. In the west, late afternoon sunlight coagulated over the cool blue ridges and folds of a jagged spine of mountains. Copeland's contact was a man named Alexandru. He was a thin, lean-jawed chap with enormous hands, which he kept folded in his lap most of the time he talked to me. He occupied a run-down yellow and white farmhouse that was quietly sinking into the curve of a turgid river. An old wooden wheel languorously turned the water and a satellite dish gleamed atop the crumbling roof, alien as some bizarre deep-sea flora among the split shakes and rotted lathing. Alexandru sat at a wide wooden trestle table, chewing a pastrami sandwich. He was stripped to the waist and awfully, awfully pale, as if he'd gone overboard donating blood to the bank. I sipped a sour local beer he'd fetched for me from somewhere deep inside the gloomy old house. Untrimmed tree branches threw dark bas-relief shadows through windows that desperately needed reglazing. Rafters ribbed the ceiling like the ridged palate of a dog's mouth. A black .357 revolver lay on the table near my right hand beside a box of shells. I picked it up and examined it. The metal was old and worn, but the serial number had been filed off the frame and trigger guard, and when I cocked it and spun the cylinder, the empty chamber still lined up under the hammer. Satisfied that the piece was in good condition, I let the hammer back down with my thumb, peeled half a dozen wrinkled banknotes from the rubber-banded roll in my pocket, and tossed them on the table, where they were crumpled by a big, heavy hand. I put the revolver away and returned the wad of notes to my trouser pocket. Plenty more where that came from anyway. Copeland always made sure I travelled flush. I drank another beer while the day drew on, strange and silent. An old war film played on the television. Somebody was torturing somebody. Somebody else were being burnt to a crisp. The light on the windows became the ghostly radiance of twilight. Then dusk. Supper was tomato soup warmed on a hot plate and served with crusty bread and several fingers of suika, a country's national drink. After we'd finished eating, Alexandru rolled a couple of joints. Soon, the pungent odor of marijuana swirled the cloistered air. I began to feel faint and dizzy. My thoughts swam disjointed while Alexandru regaled me with Baba Yaga legends and tales of wolf-like vampires called Prikolichi that rose from the grave to devour the sun and moon. At length, talk turned to the matter at hand. Alexandru rose and disappeared into the kitchen. There followed a series of thuds, a crash and clatter of pots and pans. He returned with an innocuous manila folder and laid it on the table. The folder was stuffed with goodies, reports, photographs, mimeographed medical notes and procedural documents. Numerous memos between a Dr. Mihail and a warden Maxim comprised a sheaf of typewritten letters. The medical records were gibberish to a layman's eyes. Likewise, the correspondence between the two apparatchiks proved equally inscrutable. One such article, presumably translated second-hand from the Romanian, read, Dr. Emil Mihail, inmate number 1-44783, inmate number 3-874322. Further to your previous letter, I have enclosed statements from the officers J. redacted and R. redacted. Please see also my reply to question 13 and 28. Inmate number 3-874322 continues to maintain vital signs with active medical support, but remains otherwise unresponsive. Unfortunately, we have as of yet been unable to locate the lost hepatic tissue. It is therefore presumed that said matter was consumed during inmate number 1-44783's attack. Yours, Warden Gregory Maxim, Gerla Penitentiary. Doesn't more like that. It begged the question of why Sakelski hadn't been tied to a post and shot. I removed the photos from the folder and spread them in a crescent on the table in front of me. I lifted one and looked at it. Sakelski had black goat's eyes, framed by a welter of hair. The shadow of a beard just beginning to grow blurred the edges of his face. He wore dirty army fatigues and muddy boots. I put the photo back on the table and picked up another one, a glossy 3x5 of an iron-haired gent in rimless spectacles and a tweed blazer. I looked at the back of the photo and read, Director Wilhelm von Braun, National Museum of Film, BUH. At last, a lead. Alexandru confirmed it for me. Turned out Herr Director had actually survived Sakelski's attack and was still in the museum business to boot. Next stop, Bucharest proper. That night I dreamt of wolves, monstrous and slavering, ripped straight from the pages of Stoker's seminal tale of preternatural horror. Then it was bats, huge, red-eyed fuckers. Despite my nightmares, I woke slowly, reluctantly, in the coils of a down sleeping bag. My eyes stared at the high-ribbed ceiling, at the cold silver moonlight smeared across the windows. Suddenly, I sat upright. Something moved covertly in the room. Something made of shadows. I fumbled for the holster with my left hand and drew the revolver with my right. Too late. The moon flared. A splayed hand emerged from the darkness. A huge, chalk-white spider undulating its legs. The hand crooked its long, spindly fingers and reached for me, drew me down, into the fathomless black catacombs of night. In the morning, I recalled a fragment of the dream. 5 seconds later, it was gone, and I was left wondering why I'd fallen asleep with a gun in my fist. No sign of Alexandru, however. I waited a while, but he didn't show. So, I helped myself to a hearty breakfast of bread and cold cuts and departed the farmhouse around 10 a.m. As I jounced the murk along the deeply rutted trail that led to the main road, my gaze was repeatedly drawn to the rearview mirror, to the coffee-colored Volkswagen Jetta parked next to the aforementioned building. I sped towards Bucharest, chewing things over. As for Alexandru, if I was honest, I didn't care a jot for his whereabouts. He'd turn up in the end. I knew from experience that bad pennies always did. Part 4. Dracula's Doom. Director von Braun is on annual leave, the lady at reception informed me with a frosty smile. Her voice was dry and husky, with a note of impatience in it. I thanked her and retreated across the cavernous foyer under a panelled glass ceiling that vaulted to imposing heights. I walked past a poster of Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman, looming over a supine, buxom figure, and another from H.G. Wells's Invisible Man, whose bandaged head and half-profile recalled the visage of some strange pale djinn. I wandered around, regarding with feigned interest the glass exhibit cases and the writing upon their placards until I spotted a cleaner, a tanned young man who looked a little underfed and a little dirty, trundling his squeaking cartload of mops and brooms towards a distant toilet. I followed him inside and took a mop from the trolley and wedged it under the door handle. I was 3 or 4 inches taller than him and a hell of a lot broader in the shoulders. Yet, I could see it in his eyes that he was gathering himself to move. I smiled a small, grim smile. Ballsy kid for sure. But once I greased the rails, so to speak, he positively oozed cooperation. Apparently, Director von Braun had been on annual leave for quite some time. So long, in fact, that his return was no longer expected. Naturally, this meant that his mailbox was positively overflowing with important correspondence. And was there, perchance, a forwarding address for any of these epic-making compositions? Out came the roll of bills. I peeled off a generous amount, and no less than 10 minutes later found myself slipping a letter addressed to Air Director's private estate into my blazer pocket. The von Braun family mansion was situated on the outskirts of Bucharest, an ivy-lashed Queen Anne Victorian restored, if not completely renewed, to a measure of its former splendor. Oak trees loomed against the grey belly of the sky. Water glistened far back beyond their trunks. The house had turrets and towers, dormers, wraparound balconies, and probably a few less windows than Buckingham Palace. I parked 50 feet away on a wooded shoulder where the road ended. I climbed from the Mercedes and leaned against the frame while the engine ticked until the pain in my lower back dulled from a fireworks display to a fistful of sparklers. I checked the action on the 357, holstered it against my left ribs, and buttoned my coat over it. The estate was hemmed in by a 12-foot wrought iron fence with spear-like finials and towering stone gateposts shaped like rearing horses. The horses' manes had crumbled, their chiseled flanks crept by green moss and dead vines. The gates were closed and padlocked, but I went in through an iron door set into one of the massive stone uprights, and by went in, I mean I wrenched the door back and forth until the rusted chain securing it snapped. A winding flagstone driveway climbed several hundred feet to the house between tall, sculpted hedges, all of which had gone to seed, and old weather-worn caryatids that stood like ghosts on their stone blocks. The driveway ended in a wide circle with a sunken garden in its center. This garden was dominated by an ornate three-tiered fountain with a kneeling woman of stone weeping atop its central plinth. The surface of the oblong fountain pool was thick with virid slime and pond scum, clogged with stone water lilies and dead leaves. An eternity of dead leaves. I walked over to the only car that was parked beyond the garden. It was a black Bentley, rebodied in a classic 1950s style, with a plush red interior and shiny silver louvres big enough to see the engine through. There was dried mud on the Bentley's plates and more mud splattered above the wheels. I shaded my eyes to look inside. The key was still in the ignition. I wasn't surprised to find the heavy wooden double doors slightly ajar. I poked my head through carefully. A crack of light seeped past the threshold to illuminate several feet of wine-colored carpet, and, in the deeper shadows, the foot of a wide, old-fashioned staircase. My gut and every other part of me insisted this was an ignis fatuus, a foolish fire of the highest order. Instead, I made for a side entrance and jimmied the lock. Inside, I prowled a network of gloomy corridors, barely illuminated by a series of recessed lamps. Far off, a thin, scraping sound slithered out and lost itself among the silence. The way got darker. I squinted to discern the inchoate forms of suits of armor and moth-eaten pennants, the stuffed and mounted heads of wild boars, wolves, and bears. There was a heavy smell of dust and varnish, and beyond that, a quiet, earthy smell which evoked some vague notion of primitive man. I skirted the lobby and mounted the staircase to the upper floors. At the head of the staircase, I followed what seemed to be a mile of green carpet along a shadowy corridor with formidable floor-to-ceiling paneling, upon which hung a series of oil paintings so dark they were almost black. I paused to inspect one of them. It took me a while to make out what it was, but as the image gained clarity, I saw that it was a stiffly posed portrait of a guy in a suit. There was something wrong with his head, though. It was deformed, misshapen. His face was too many faces, melded one to the other, and there were fanged faces surmounted by porcine snouts. The small bronze placard underneath the painting read, "The Stranger on the Road to Erasmus." Damn thing gave me the willies. I didn't stop to examine the rest of the series. The corridor ended in a T-shaped junction. Nothing moved in the dingy hall on the left. On the right, in the opposite direction, a wedge of muddy light seeped past the edge of an almost closed door. I stood like a statue and listened. Someone was mawing a violin. The sound scratched my cerebrum like 1,000 fingernails. I made my way down the hall, thought about drawing the revolver but didn't. The door opened quietly, and I was looking in on the polished wood interior of a brooding study with a tall, double-arched bay window and rearing cabinets of antique projectors and film canisters, the labels of which had yellowed to illegibility. A deep, leather armchair had been dragged into the middle of the room, and in it was Director von Braun himself, utterly transfixed, while Dracula's doom flickered on the opposite wall. He was sitting very straight, with his hands grasping the arms of the chair. His eyes were strained wide. They were all iris, and shone madly in the stuttering light. I went over and stopped the projector. The wall went dark. I wound the film back onto the reel and slid it off the spindle into an unmarked metal canister. Hair director drooled and whimpered in animal dread. There were trickles of blood at the corners of his eyes, and his iron hair had turned completely white, like Harker's after his visit to Castle Dracula. Mission accomplished, I was eager to get the hell out of Dodge. I left the good director to the darkness and retraced my steps through the maze of corridors. The way branched and branched again. I took a left and then a right, and had paused, unsure where I was or in which direction I should proceed when, quite suddenly, a loud smell of wet earth rolled over me. Sikowski called my name from somewhere nearby. I knew it was him, and kept quiet while I unbuttoned my coat. But it was no good, and the revolver was barely in my hand when he dropped me like a bad habit. I rolled onto my back and saw the bastard hefting some sort of stunted club, which wouldn't have looked out of place in a medieval armory. The revolver jumped and flames spouted from the barrel. Blood spurted from Sikowski's forehead. He grinned at me through his matted beard and clubbed my left forearm. I hissed through my teeth as an electric jolt of pain shot through me. Sikowski pried the gun from my fist and sent it skating, almost snapping my fingers in the process. A large serrated knife leapt into his hand from somewhere. He leaned in close, and the green stench of rancid meat invaded my nostrils, gagging me. "Reality. It's just a door," he whispered. "After all my searching, all my orisons to the dark, I finally realized that all I needed to do was knock." He chuckled, weighing the knife in his hand. Then he went to work on my leg. My feet drummed a frantic tattoo on the wooden floor. I tried and failed to tamp down a scream. I wanted to put this fucker on his knees and break every bone in his body, but my right leg was a blazing pillar of fire, and the rest of my muscles were hardening to bags of cement, as if I'd just gone 10 rounds with a Motor City Cobra. My vision had composed itself into a tunnel, at the small end of which floated Sikowski's face, ghastly pale in contrast to the glistening black blood decanting from his forehead. The agony in my leg flared brighter. I assured myself that pain, like everything else in this strange and cursory world, was inconsequential. That flight of fancy lasted all of a few seconds until I was wrenched back to the reality of my situation. And when, after a time, my consciousness finally decided to call it quits, all that remained was darkness and nullity, and the dead march of Sikowski's disembodied voice, echoing in the void. Part 5. London, October of 1983. I swallowed a palmful of colourful M&Ms and chased them with a vodka on the rocks. If I hadn't been a hardened drunk before Bucharest, I certainly was now. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour. Above it, a mirror showed a middle-aged man in a wrinkled brown suit, with a tired face full of shadows and a thick, white scar across his throat. I stared at myself for a moment longer. Then, with a sweep of my arm, I hurled my empty tumbler at the mirror. Glass flew. A thin sliver sliced my cheek like a razor blade. Blood oozed from the cut and crawled down a deep line at the corner of my mouth. Sikowski's words came back to me then, as I dabbed at the cut with my handkerchief. Blood is just a metaphor, Noah. The alkahest of the abyss itself. The blackest reaches that hide behind the veil of flesh. I had another drink, or two, Gave it 10 more minutes before I lifted my cane off the table, got hold of my briefcase with the other hand, leaned weight on the cane, and stood up. I limped out of the flat and made my way slowly down the hall, jabbing the cane into the burgundy fiber carpet. The lift at the end of the hall was small and mirrored. I rode it down to the lobby, studiously avoiding my reflection in the polished walls for fear of stirring up all manner of things best left alone. I felt woozy and expansive from a lethal cocktail of booze and pills. Perhaps that's why, when the lift doors opened, reality skipped a beat, and I found myself climbing the colonnaded steps of Copeland's front porch. I jabbed at the doorbell until a waiter in a werewolf mask and white tuxedo admitted me. The cavernous lobby was decorated with faux cobwebs, large rubbery spiders, and a coterie of plastic skeletons. Somewhere further inside, I could hear the muffled thumping sound of loud music. A valet, dressed as a sheep blown loose from a washing line, floated over. Had the gentleman driven this evening? No, the gentleman had not. Shock of that, given my current condition. The werewolf led me to the drawing room. A disco ball strobed, and I spotted Batman, Superman, and even a few Star Wars cameos among the dancing guests. I went over to the bar where a couple of zombies were chewing the fat, with someone dressed in a grey boiler suit and a smooth plastic William Shatner mask a la John Carpenter's Halloween. I sat down on a red stool, leaned my cane against the bar, and ordered a whiskey sour. The barman was lavishly dressed in a black suit, had his hair slicked with oil, and a pair of plastic fangs on full display. The ivory white paint on his face and neck crept beneath his collar. Thankfully, there wasn't a violin in sight. I signaled Dracula for another drink. He showed me his fangs and stooped beneath the bar. After a while, I got up again and inched my way through the crowd until I was back in the hall. Despite my best attempts at senselessness, the pain in my phantom leg was scarcely blunted by its absence. Maybe an eon or two passed before I found Copeland, chatting with a former Secretary of State at the threshold of the French doors that led into the library. There was a flash of pity in his eyes, coupled with the remote speculation of a lepidopterist studying a speared moth, wondering how it was still alive. "Noah, old chap, it's good to see you back on your feet." His mouth ticked in a grimace, and his lips worked silently as he realized what he'd said. I nodded and sipped my whiskey. An instant of silence stretched between us, heavy and all-consuming as a black hole. The erstwhile Secretary of State hurriedly excused himself and fled. "Well," Copeland said at last, looking anywhere but at my missing leg, "I hear you've got something for me." I showed him my teeth and handed him the briefcase. His eyes widened. "Is it?" "A complete article, from beginning to end." He didn't ask me about the gravelly huskiness in my voice, about the nasty scar across my windpipe. I brought him Dracula's Doom, as promised. That was all that really mattered. "Great Scott," he said. He jiggled his pipe between his lips and straightened his jacket. "I'll have Maurice bring your check immediately." I killed the last of the whiskey and sucked my gums while Copeland barked orders at a pair of waiters. Then, a little at a time, his voice faded until only silence issued from his mouth. Within moments, every sound was hushed or otherwise held in abeyance. The world became a silent film, devoid of subtitles. And then I heard it, the clarion moan of a violin drifting through that unearthly hush, echoing from a far more remote locale than Vernon Copeland's drawing room. I shut my eyes, and when I opened them, the hall was dark, save for a dim, red effulgence polluting the blackness, when something was approaching from within the light, moving or hovering with alarming speed, so pale, so deeply red, a macerated wound with a bloody radiance leaking from its depths, and a face like a porcelain death mask hovering in the air, a mask with a cruel, rapacious smile playing on its lips. The violin soared a semitone higher, driving an icy stake through what was left of my mind, my sanity. The bloody light flared scarlet and crimson, like rays from a punctured sun. Time burned to ash, and the ashes scattered in the void. I shook with crazed laughter as the world came loose of its moorings. A moment later, in a sudden dislocation of memory, I found myself back at Lièvre d'Or, back in March of the previous year. I forked a slice of venison into my mouth, even as Copeland, who in the B-side to my current psychosis was screaming uncontrollably, singing a hymn of horror to the face of a ravenous abyss, licked his lips and said, "Good God, Noah, if I could lay my hands on the full version of Dracula's Doom, now that would be a Halloween party for the ages."
Chilling tales for dark nights.